Welcome back to another story on Vision Harry. This time, we're bringing you, Sorting Hat discovered Harry's 19 ancient lordships and screamed Dumbledore stole 2 million galleons. Your likes fuel our creativity. Subscribe and stay tuned. Here's the story. Chapter 1, The Hat screams. The Sorting Hat smelled like old libraries and something else, something Harry couldn't name, something that reminded him of the feeling he got standing at the edge of very tall things. He was third in line behind a pale boy named Terry Boot and a girl with red plates who'd introduced herself as Susan Bones on the boat over. The Great Hall was everything he'd imagined and nothing like it at the same time. The candles were real. The ceiling was genuinely moving, slow purple clouds drifting across stars that had no business being visible through a roof. The older students at the 4 long tables were watching the first years with the particular brand of casual cruelty that older children deploy on younger ones, sizing them up, whispering to each other, laughing at things that hadn't been said out loud yet. Harry stood with his hands loose at his sides and looked back at them without blinking. He'd gotten good at that. The Dursleys had taught him, without meaning to, that flinching only made things worse. Professor McGonagall, sharp-faced, tartan-robed, radiating the kind of authority that didn't need to announce itself, set a 3-legged stool in front of the staff table and placed an ancient, battered hat on top of it. The hat was patched and frayed and had a rip near the brim that looked like a mouth, and then it was a mouth, and the hat began to sing. Harry listened to the song with genuine interest. Houses. Gryffindor, Hufflepuff, Ravenclaw, Slytherin. Bravery, loyalty, wit, ambition. He'd read about this. Hermione Granger, currently standing 2 spots behind him, probably vibrating with the effort of not reciting the founders' names aloud, had clearly memorized the relevant chapter. What Harry hadn't read about, what no book had mentioned, was the way the hat seemed to breathe when it was waiting. The rip that served as its mouth opened and closed slowly, almost thoughtfully, like something alive that was deciding how hungry it was. Boot, Terry. Terry Boot walked up, sat down, and had the hat on his head for about 4 seconds before it shouted Ravenclaw. The Ravenclaw table applauded with the restrained enthusiasm of people who'd expected exactly that. Susan Bones went to Hufflepuff. Harry watched her walk to the table and felt something like gladness for her. She'd seemed like a Hufflepuff, warm and straightforward and kind in the way that people sometimes mistake for simple. Names kept being called. Lavender Brown. Millicent Bulstrode. Vincent Crabbe. Each sorting took between 2 seconds and 2 minutes. Each time, the hat called out a house and the relevant table cheered and life continued in an orderly, institutional way. Then McGonagall looked down at her scroll and said, "Potter, Harry." The Great Hall went quiet so completely that Harry could hear the candles. He walked up between the long rows of students, aware of the stares the way you become aware of sunburn, not painful yet, just present, impossible to ignore. He heard whispers that weren't really whispers. "Potter. Is that really, Harry Potter? The scar, look, you can see, that's him, that's actually," he sat on the stool. The hat came down over his eyes and the Great Hall disappeared. Well. The voice wasn't in his ears. It was behind them, between them, inside the part of his head where he kept things he hadn't said yet. It was old in a way that wasn't unpleasant, the oldness of stone walls and deep wells and maps that showed places that no longer existed. "I have been doing this for 1,000 years, the hat said, and I have never," it stopped. Harry felt something stir. Not inside himself, or not only inside himself. It was like standing in a dark room and watching someone else's eyes adjust to the light, watching them start to see what you'd already been seeing. "Oh," said the hat. Its voice had changed. Gone was the measured, thoughtful tone of a consciousness sorting through options. What replaced it was something Harry had no word for, recognition, maybe, but larger than that, the kind of recognition you'd feel if you opened a box that had been sealed for centuries and found everything exactly where you'd left it. Oh, boy. What? Harry thought back at it, because he'd understood instinctively that this was a two-way conversation. "I need a moment." "Take your time." You don't understand. You have, the hat's voice was doing something Harry had never heard a voice do before. It was cycling through registers, moving from low to high and back again, the verbal equivalent of someone running their hands through their hair repeatedly. How long has it been since someone checked? Has no one checked? You've been walking around like this and no one has checked. Checked what? Your lordships. Harry didn't know what that meant. But the hat's voice had taken on a quality that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up, not fear, something else, something that felt like the moment before a door opens. What lordships? I'm going to list them, the hat said, and there was something in its tone now that Harry recognized from a completely different context, from the rare moments when Dudley had broken something expensive and the sound of Uncle Vernon's footsteps had been coming down the hall. I'm going to list them and I need you to remain calm. I'm very calm. Potter. Ancient and most noble house. Lord of record, currently vacant, accounts under external management since July 31, 1981. Harry absorbed that. All right. Peveril. Ancient and most noble house. Lord of record, vacant, dormant since 1291, dormant no longer as of this moment. Peveril, Harry repeated. He'd heard that name somewhere. In a story, maybe. Gryffindor. Ancient and most noble house. The hat let that one land. Harry sat very still. Slytherin. Ancient and noble house, matrilineal descent through your grandmother's line, Doria Blackney Potter, lineage confirmed. Wait, Merlin. Ancient and most noble, you said Gryffindor. And Slytherin, yes. Both. I told you to remain calm. Merlin. Ancient and most noble house, a courtesy lordship tied to the office itself, passed by magical inheritance to the last magical heir, which is, me. You. Continuing. Emrys. Pendragon, that one's complicated, I'll explain later. Black, through your godfather, who named you heir before his imprisonment and never rescinded it. Gaunt, through the Slytherin line. Fleamont, your grandfather's house, separate from Potter proper. Ignotus Peveril, that's already covered under Peveril, technically, but it carries its own lordship title. Morrigan. Ravenclaw, secondary title, again matrilineal, again through Doria. Hufflepuff, that's 4 founders. Yes. I have all 4 founders' lordships. 3 of them directly, 1 through inheritance. Continuing, Flammel, that's the Nicholas Flamel line, passed through alchemical bequest to the last proven magical heir of the Peveril bloodline, that is to say, you. And lastly, Le Fay. The Morgana Le Fay line. Which brings us to 19. The silence inside Harry's head was absolute. 19. 19 ancient lordships, some dormant for hundreds of years, some recently vacated, all of them, technically, legally, magically his. All right, Harry said, because he had to say something, and that was the thing that came out. You said something about accounts. Under external management. Yes. The hat's voice had gone very flat. I did say that. Who's managing them? Harry. Who? The headmaster, the hat said. Albus Dumbledore. He has had power of attorney over the Potter account since your parents' deaths, granted, supposedly, on the basis of your parents' will, which designated him as your guardian. Except that the will has never been formally read. And the accounts have been accessed regularly for the past 10 years. Harry was 11 years old and he had lived his entire life in a cupboard under the stairs. He had worn his cousin's hand-me-downs. He had eaten the burnt bits of meals and been told, every time he asked for anything, a new pair of shoes, a birthday cake, 5 minutes on the telephone, that there was no money for that sort of thing. The Dursleys had no money. But apparently Harry Potter did. Had. 2,437,000 galleons, the hat said quietly. That is the approximate total of the withdrawals from the accounts under Dumbledore's management over the past decade. Some of it went to the Order of the Phoenix's operational fund. Some of it went to various individuals. Payments. Investments. At least 300,000 galleons appear to have gone directly into a Gringotts account registered to a BWD Dumbledore. Harry sat with that for a long moment. His personal account. His personal account. Outside Harry's head, in the Great Hall, 30 seconds had passed. Students were starting to shift. McGonagall was looking at the hat with an expression that was trying very hard to remain composed and not entirely succeeding. Dumbledore, at the center of the staff table, had his fingers steepled beneath his chin and was watching the hat with those famously piercing blue eyes, which had recently lost some of their twinkle. "I need to tell you one more thing," the hat said. "Go ahead. I am not a subtle instrument. I can whisper to the child wearing me, or I can speak. In this room, right now, with this much magical inheritance radiating out of you, I am having some difficulty keeping my voice down. What I've told you, I've told it to you. But the Great Hall there may have been some, leakage. Yes. I'm sorry. I have never encountered anything like this. The sheer volume of, it's fine," Harry said. "Actually, don't apologize. Say it again. Say all of it again. Louder." The hat went completely silent. "You want me to say it to the room," Harry said. "All of it. The Lordships. The accounts. Dumbledore's name. Say it to everyone." "Harry, he's been stealing from me for 10 years, Harry said, and his voice inside his own head was very level, very clear, the voice of someone who has just made a decision and doesn't intend to unmake it. "I grew up in a cupboard. I didn't have a birthday cake until I was 11. I didn't know I was a wizard until last month. And he was here the whole time, taking money out of my family's vaults, and no one thought to mention it. If I do this, there is no taking it back. I know. The entire school will hear. The staff. The headmaster himself. I know that too. You're 11 years old. I'm aware." A pause. And then the hat said, with something that might have been admiration, "All right, then." The rip that served as the hat's mouth opened very wide. And the Sorting Hat screamed. Not a scream of pain or fear, a scream of proclamation, the way a herald's trumpet is a kind of scream, the way a judge's gavel is a kind of scream, sharp and absolute and leaving no room for anyone to pretend they hadn't heard. "Harry James Potter," the hat bellowed, its voice filling the great hall from stone floor to enchanted ceiling, rattling the plates, making several first-years grab each other's arms, "I.S. Lord of 19 ancient houses, Potter, Peveril, Gryffindor, Slytherin, Merlin, Mrys, Pendragon, Black, Gaunt, Fleamont, Ignotus, Morrigan, Ravenclaw, Hufflepuff, Flammel, Fay, and 3 others sealed beneath blood wards that have not been broken in 4 centuries, the Great Hall was absolutely frozen. "And Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore has withdrawn 2,437,000 galleons from the Potter and associated family vaults over the past 10 years, including 300,000 to a personal account. I have examined the magical traces and they do not lie, the accounts are documented, the withdrawals are documented, the forgeries in the guardianship record are, that is enough." Dumbledore's voice was quiet. That was the frightening thing about it, not loud, not panicked, just quiet, with a kind of controlled authority that had been developed over decades of being the most powerful person in any room he entered. He rose from his chair at the center of the staff table and the great hall's silence shifted from shock to something else, something more complicated, the silence of people waiting to see which way a very tall tree was going to fall. "That is enough," he said again, and looked at the hat with those blue eyes. "We will address this through the appropriate channels." The hat, remarkably, laughed. "You built the appropriate channels, Albus. You are the appropriate channels. That's rather the problem." Then Harry pulled it off his head. He set it back on the stool with both hands, carefully, the way you'd set down something you were grateful to but no longer needed. Then he stood up and looked at Dumbledore. The headmaster was looking back at him. They regarded each other across the length of the great hall, 11-year-old boy, ancient wizard, and the thing that Harry felt was not fear. It was not anger, though anger was in there. It was something colder and more useful, the feeling of having just understood the shape of a problem clearly enough to start solving it. "I'd like to be sorted, please," Harry said to McGonagall. McGonagall was gripping her scroll so tightly it had crinkled at the edges. Her face had gone a complicated color. "Mr. Potter, under the circumstances, perhaps, Gryffindor," Harry said. "I'd like to be in Gryffindor, if that's still how it works." The hat said I could choose. He looked at the hat. The hat dipped its brim, just once, in confirmation. "Gryffindor," it announced. The Gryffindor table erupted. Not the polite applause they'd been managing for the other sortings, this was something louder, more confused, a cheer that didn't quite know whether it was cheering for a house placement or for whatever it had just witnessed, settling on cheering for both because the alternative was sitting in silence and nobody wanted that. Harry walked to the Gryffindor table and sat down across from a red-haired boy who was staring at him with his mouth open and a twin on either side of him who were wearing identical expressions of absolute delight. "That," said one of the twins, "was the greatest sorting in 1,000 years of recorded Hogwarts history." "Easily," said the other. "No competition." "None." The 1842 sorting where McGregor accidentally set fire to the hat doesn't even come close. "I'm Fred," said the first. "He's George." "I'm Harry," said Harry. "We know," they said together, and smiled at him like he was their favorite new acquisition. The boy with his mouth open finally closed it. "Ron," he said. "Ron Weasley. I was on the train with you. I remember." Harry did remember, freckled, nervous, kind in the uncomplicated way younger siblings often are. He'd shared a compartment with Harry and they'd eaten a frankly irresponsible amount of sweets. "Good to see you, Ron." That was, what the hat said, was that real? Seemed real. 19 Lordships. Gryffindor's Lordship. "You have Gryffindor's Lordship." "And Slytherin's," Fred said helpfully. "And the 4 founders collectively," George added. "Historically unprecedented. Someone should write that down." "Someone will," Harry said, and picked up a goblet of pumpkin juice, and discovered that his hands were steady, which surprised him slightly. He'd expected them to be shaking. They weren't. The entire hall just heard it. "I'd imagine the prophet will have something to say by morning." Down the table, Percy Weasley, prefect badge catching the candlelight, expression suggesting a man rapidly revising everything he thought he knew, was already attempting to compose himself back to dignity and not quite managing it. At the staff table, the situation was less orderly. Harry didn't stare, but he watched from the corner of his eye. Dumbledore had sat back down and resumed his expression of serene authority. It was a remarkable performance, genuinely, but several of the other staff members were clearly having private emergencies at varying intensities. Professor McGonagall had gone from complicated color to something approaching white. Professor Snape was completely still in a way that was itself a kind of reaction, his black eyes fixed somewhere in the middle distance with an expression Harry couldn't parse. Professor Quirrell, the defense teacher, had knocked over his goblet. A turban-wearing, water-soaked Professor Quirrell was dabbing at his robes with a napkin and looking, Harry thought, unusually distressed for a man who merely had wet sleeves. The sorting continued. Hermione Granger came up to the hat. The hat placed it on her head, glanced at the enormous amount of intelligence radiating out of her like a small star, and said Gryffindor in about 4 seconds, a notably quick decision for a hat that had just spent the better part of a minute emotionally detonating the sorting ceremony. Hermione walked to the table, sat down a few spots from Harry, and was visibly burning with the need to say about 40 things simultaneously. She settled for, "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," Harry said. "Are you?" I need to think about what I just heard. I need to really think about it. Are those numbers accurate? 2 million galleons, that's roughly the GDP of a small wizarding territory. Those numbers have to be. The hat said it examined the magical traces. Magical traces in a sorting hat aren't legally admissible in a Wisengamot proceeding. The standard of evidence for financial crime against a minor would require certified Gringotts records and a vault audit and at least 2 independent. Hermione, Harry said. She stopped. I know, he said. I'll get the Gringotts records. She blinked at him. Then something shifted behind her eyes, the particular shift that happens when someone stops explaining a problem and starts respecting the person they're explaining it to. Right, she said. All right. Good. The last students were sorted. Neville Longbottom, round-faced, anxious, clutching a toad named Trevor like a lifeline, sat down under the hat for about a minute and a half before it shouted Gryffindor in a tone that suggested mild surprise. He made his way to the table, tripped over the bench, sat down heavily, and looked at Harry with the expression of someone who had a lot of questions and no idea which one to ask first. Are the Lordships real? He said. Yes. My Gran mentioned, she always said, there are old families that have seats on the Wisengamot, and seats come with Lordships, and some families have had their Wisengamot seats managed by. He stopped. Looked at his hands. Do you know if it's just your accounts? Or other families too? Harry looked at him steadily. I don't know yet. Why? Neville's jaw tightened in a way that made him look, briefly, considerably older than 11. Because my family's finances have been managed by the Dumbledore-appointed Wisengamot Trust Committee since I was a year old. And Gran always said there was less than there should be, but she could never get anyone to explain the difference, and they'd always just tell her the losses were due to the war. The Great Hall had moved on, food had appeared on the tables in that sudden Hogwarts way, conversation had resumed in a cautious, buzzing register of people processing something large, and Harry looked at Neville and thought about the war and the losses and the committees managing the money of families who couldn't defend themselves, and he said, when I go to Gringotts, I'll ask them to check your accounts too. Neville opened his mouth. Closed it. Said, very quietly, thank you. They ate. The food was extraordinary and Harry ate a remarkable amount of it, which felt like making a point, though he wasn't sure to whom. Fred and George kept up a running commentary on the staff table. Sprout looks like she can't decide whether to be horrified or impressed. Flitwick has gone very small, smaller than usual even. Snape hasn't blinked in 11 minutes, I've been counting. Dumbledore is eating his chicken like nothing happened, which is either dignified or completely terrifying. Both, Harry said. Definitely both. Ron kept glancing at the staff table and back at Harry with the uncertain expression of someone who'd been raised in a family that had a complicated but ultimately reverent relationship with Dumbledore's name. Do you think the hat might have been, mistaken? Harry said. I was going to say, maybe there's an explanation, there might be, Harry said, perfectly pleasantly. I'm going to find out what it is. Ron clearly wanted to say more but seemed to sense that Harry didn't have room for doubt in the way Ron did, not because Harry was certain, but because Harry had spent 10 years with no good explanation for why he was living in a cupboard while other people had bedrooms, and he had learned the hard way that good explanations, when they existed, tended to be offered up front. After the feast, the prefects led the first years through the castle. Percy Weasley led the Gryffindors with a kind of determined normality that Harry respected even as he found it slightly funny. The castle was tremendous and strange and Harry felt it noticing him the way the hat had, not hostile, not afraid, more the way a dog will look at someone new with its head tilted slightly to one side, working out what you are. Portraits watched him. He watched them back. The Gryffindor common room was through a portrait of a fat lady in a pink dress who looked Harry over with bright, interested eyes and said, "Cacophonia," when Percy gave the password. Inside, deep red armchairs, a fire that didn't need tending, a noticeboard covered in old notices that nobody had taken down. Comfortable in the way that places are when they've absorbed generations of people feeling comfortable in them. Percy said some things about rules and curfew and Harry listened politely. Then the girls went up their staircase and the boys went up theirs, and the dormitory was 6 beds with dark red hangings and an 11-year-old's dream's worth of space, which Harry appreciated with an almost physical warmth. He sat on the edge of his bed after the other boys had gone to sleep, Neville curled tightly around Trevor, Ron already snoring gently, Dean and Seamus having apparently bonded over Quidditch before even reaching the dormitory, and he opened his trunk. At the bottom of it, under his textbooks and his spare robes and the photograph album Hagrid had given him, was a small wooden box he hadn't put there. He was sure of that. He'd packed his trunk himself, deliberately and carefully, because packing carefully was something he'd learned to do when the alternative was leaving things in places where Dudley might find them. The box hadn't been there when he'd closed the trunk at the Leaky Cauldron. He picked it up. It was light and warm against his palms, the wood a deep reddish-brown he didn't recognize, carved along the edges with patterns that were almost runes but not quite, older than runes, maybe, or a kind of rune he hadn't been taught yet. There was no lock. The lid opened when he touched it. Inside, on a bed of dark velvet, were 19 rings. Not all the same. That was the first thing. They were 19 distinct pieces, different metals and stones and styles spanning what looked like centuries of craft, some plain bands, some heavily worked, one that was barely more than a twist of what looked like goblin gold, one that had a stone in it that was definitely not any color Harry had a name for. But they each had something in common, a mark on the inner band, tiny, the same on all of them. A lightning bolt. His scar, mirrored in metal. Harry sat with them in his hands for a long time. He hadn't asked for them. He hadn't known they existed this morning. Yesterday, no, 2 days ago, he'd been Harry Nobody from Privet Drive, and now he was sitting in a Hogwarts dormitory at midnight with 19 rings in his palm and a headmaster who had, if the Sorting Hat was to be believed, been stealing from him since before Harry could walk. He wasn't frightened. He checked for fear the way you check a wound, carefully, running your attention over it, and found something else there instead, something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite determination and was possibly just a very clear view of what came next. He put the box back in his trunk. Not the rings, he kept those out, turned them over in his fingers for a while longer, then set them in a careful row on his bedside table. 19 of them. One for each house. Each family. Each piece of himself that had existed before he did, waiting. He thought about the cupboard under the stairs. He thought about the burnt pieces of breakfast and the hand-me-down shoes, and every time someone had told him, explicitly, implicitly, through the simple architecture of his life, that he was less than, smaller than, and should be grateful for whatever scraps were extended in his direction. He thought about Neville's face when he said there was less than there should be. He thought about 2 million galleons moving through accounts while Harry Potter ate the burnt bits and was told there was nothing for him. Then he lay back on pillows that were softer than anything he'd slept on before, and he looked at the dark ceiling, and he thought about Gringotts. Tomorrow was a Thursday. Classes started Monday. He had 4 days. 4 days was enough. He closed his eyes, and slept, and did not dream. In the morning, the owls came. Harry had been warned about this. Hagrid had mentioned it, grinning broadly. You'll be famous, Harry, absolute celebrity. But the experience of having 11 owls arrive at breakfast simultaneously and drop letters and packages and what appeared to be a small bouquet of congratulatory flowers onto your plate was something that no amount of warning fully prepared you for. He opened the letters methodically, in order of size, while eating toast. Most of them were from people he didn't know, Wisingamot members, other old families, various parties who had apparently been waiting for the Potter lordship to be claimed for a decade and were now writing to congratulate him with varying degrees of sincerity and transparent self-interest. One was from a woman named Amelia Bones, Susan Bones's aunt, he'd find out later, director of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, brief and professional and notably not congratulatory, simply noting that her office would need to speak with him at his earliest convenience regarding certain disclosures made public the previous evening. One was from Gringotts. That one he read twice. It was signed by someone named Ragnarok. The signature alone gave off a faint heat. Lord Potter Peveril, it read, "We are aware of the disclosures made during your sorting ceremony and wish you to know that Gringotts was not complicit in the management irregularities described. Our records indicate a number of unauthorized accesses to the accounts under your name, conducted through forged magical authorization instruments, and we would request your attendance at your earliest convenience to conduct a full inheritance audit. Be advised that Gringotts considers this matter to be of the highest priority and that a number of individuals currently holding access privileges to Potter-associated accounts may find those privileges revoked within the hour. Regards, Ragnarok, Chief of Gringotts." Harry put the letter down. "Who's Ragnarok?" he asked Fred, who was sitting across from him eating an extraordinary amount of sausage. "Chief of Gringotts," Fred said promptly. "Head goblin. Never met a wizard personally in about 50 years, does everything through intermediaries." "Why?" Harry held up the letter. Fred took it. "Read it." Handed it to George without saying anything. George read it. His eyebrows went very high. He handed it back to Harry. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "when we thought last night was interesting, we hadn't fully processed that it was only going to become more interesting from there." "I need to get to Gringotts," Harry said. "This week." "You're 11, Ron said from down the table. He said it not unkindly, just as a statement of logistics. "Can first years even leave Hogwarts without, I'm lord of 19 houses, Harry said. "I have a seat on the Wisengamot. Am I actually required to ask Dumbledore's permission to do anything?" Ron opened his mouth and then, very clearly, had no answer for that. Hermione, who had been reading the letter over Harry's shoulder without technically being invited to, he'd noticed but hadn't minded, said, "Technically, as a minor, the standard guardian protocols would, my guardian," Harry said, "is the person who stole 2 million galleons from me." Another silence. "Right," Hermione said. "We'll need to find another legal framework. There are provisions for emancipated minors in wizarding law, but those usually require, let me think. If you claim your lordships formally, all 19 of them, with Gringotts as witness, the legal argument would be that you are functionally an adult head of house and no longer require guardianship of any kind. The statute is, I think it's the Inheritance and Majority Act of 1692, I read about it in ancient wizarding law and modern applications, it's a bit dry but, is she always like this?" George asked Harry quietly. "I think so," Harry said. "I think it's quite useful, actually." Hermione was still talking. "But you'd need to physically attend Gringotts, and Hogwarts is technically a closed institution during term for first through third years unless the headmaster grants permission to, or, Harry said, unless there's a formal summons from an entity with sufficient legal standing that Hogwarts is obligated to honor it." He held up the letter from Ragnarok. Hermione stopped. Looked at the letter. Looked at Harry. "Gringotts has independent jurisdiction," she said slowly. "They're not subject to ministry oversight, which means Hogwarts's authority doesn't supersede, a summons from the Chief of Gringotts," Harry said, "is probably enough." Hermione sat back. Looked at him with an expression he'd come to recognize over the following years, the expression she wore when someone else had gotten to the answer by a slightly different route and she was in the process of deciding whether to be impressed or competitive. She landed on impressed, this time. "Yes. It probably is." Down the table, at a distance that was close enough to hear if you were quiet enough, Percy Weasley was writing a letter to his mother with the frantic energy of a man trying to make sense of events that had outpaced his considerable gift for institutional loyalty. At the staff table, Dumbledore was having tea. He was, as far as anyone could observe, quite calm. He had been quite calm all morning. He had the quality of calm that is not the absence of thought but the active management of it, the calm of a chess player who has just watched 3 of his pawns disappear from the board and is already calculating whether he still has a path to a draw. He looked, once, at Harry. Harry looked back, caught his eye, and nodded pleasantly, the nod you give to someone you've met and whose name you know and whose moves you're watching. Then he went back to his toast. At the Slytherin table, across the hall, Draco Malfoy was staring at him with an expression Harry couldn't quite read from this distance, not the contempt he'd expected, not after the train, not after the hat. Something more complicated. Something that looked, strangely, like the expression of someone revising their calculations. Neville slid down the bench to sit next to Harry. He didn't say anything for a moment. Just looked at the letter from Ragnarok that Harry had set on the table. Then, when you go to Gringotts, can I come? Harry looked at him. Thought about there was less than there should be, about a boy who'd been told the losses were due to the war, who'd grown up knowing something was wrong and having no proof, no leverage, no one who could do anything about it. Yes, Harry said. Absolutely. Neville let out a breath he'd been holding for what looked like years. Outside the tall windows of the great hall, the sky over the Black Lake was clear and cold, the kind of blue that meant autumn was getting serious about its intentions. The owls were leaving, most of them, carrying replies or simply gone. One remained, a large tawny owl that Harry didn't recognize, sitting on the back of his chair and watching him with amber eyes that were, for an owl, extremely alert. Tied to its leg was a letter with no return address. The seal, when Harry broke it, was a small embossed axe. The letter inside was 3 lines, the Potters built the first wing of Gringotts. They were friends when friends were costly. We have not forgotten. Neither should you. Come when you are ready. Come soon. Harry folded the letter. Put it in his robe pocket. Patted the tawny owl, which ruffled its feathers with great dignity and then flew away. Who was that from? Fred asked. Gringotts again, Harry said. What does it say? Harry picked up his goblet. That I have allies. Fred and George looked at each other with the synchronized telepathy of twins who have spent 11 years operating as a unit. Then they looked at Harry with expressions of delighted, wholly committed interest. We, Fred said, are going to have a very good year. The best year, George agreed. Harry smiled, for the first time since last night, a real smile, not the controlled, directed expression he'd been wearing since the hat finished screaming. It surprised him slightly, the way real smiles sometimes do when you've been in management mode long enough that you forget they're still available. Yeah, he said. I think we might. The morning carried on. Classes would begin Monday. Gringotts was waiting. 19 rings were sitting in a box in his trunk, each one a key to something old and powerful and entirely, legally, irrevocably his. And somewhere at the center of the staff table, Albus Dumbledore sipped his tea and stared at the distance and began, very quietly, to be afraid. Chapter 2, The Weight of Gold. The letter from Amelia Bones arrived again on Friday morning, this time with a ministry seal pressed so firmly into the wax it had cracked at the edges. The message itself was longer than the first, less professional, more urgent. Words like formal inquiry and preliminary investigation and at your earliest convenience appeared 3 times each, which Harry took to mean that at your earliest convenience had stopped meaning what it usually meant and had started meaning today, please, or possibly yesterday. He wrote back on a piece of parchment he borrowed from Hermione and said he would be available after his Gringotts visit, which he intended to complete by Saturday at the latest, and that he looked forward to cooperating fully with the DMLE's inquiry. He signed it Harry James Potter, Lord Potter Peverell. It was the first time he'd written that title. It felt strange in the way that new shoes feel strange, not wrong, just unfamiliar, requiring a period of adjustment before it sat right. He sealed the letter, found an owl in the owlery that looked agreeable, paid it with an owl treat Hermione had inexplicably thought to bring, and sent it before breakfast was over. Getting to Gringotts required 2 things. First, McGonagall. Second, McGonagall being in a frame of mind where she would say yes. He found her outside the Transfiguration classroom on Friday afternoon, between lessons, and knocked on the open door. She looked up from a stack of papers with the expression of someone who had been expecting exactly this visit and had been drafting her response since roughly 9 o'clock the previous evening. Potter, she said. Professor. He stepped inside. I need to get to Gringotts. I have a formal summons from the chief. I have two, actually. This one, he set Ragnar's letter on her desk, and this one. He placed the second letter beside it, the three-line note with the embossed axe. McGonagall looked at both letters without picking them up. Then she looked at Harry with the careful attention of someone trying to take the measure of a thing that keeps refusing to stay the size they expected. These were sent directly to you. Yes. Ragnar hasn't communicated directly with a Hogwarts student in, she stopped herself. I don't know when he last did, Harry said pleasantly. But the formal summons supersedes Hogwarts's term restrictions, I believe. For matters of inheritance and estate. McGonagall picked up the formal letter. Read it. Set it down. You've looked into the legal framework. Hermione helped. Something almost like amusement moved across McGonagall's face, gone quickly. I see. And you intend to go Saturday? Yes. Neville Longbottom will be accompanying me. I believe he has his own inheritance matters that need addressing. Another careful look. Mr. Longbottom. His family accounts have been under Wisengamot Trust Committee management since he was an infant, Harry said. He deserves to know what that means. McGonagall was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, a group of third-years were crossing the courtyard in their cloaks, laughing about something, ordinary in the way that Hogwarts students are when the castle is just a school and not the site of the most significant inheritance revelation in a century. She watched them with an expression Harry couldn't fully read, complicated, turned inward. Then she picked up a quill. I'll arrange a portkey to Diagon Alley. Saturday at 7. You'll want to be early. Gringotts opens to inheritance claims at 8, but if Ragnar himself is expecting you, they'll let you in before the public hours. She paused. You'll take Mr. Longbottom, and I'll come with you. Harry hadn't expected that. You don't have to. I know I don't have to, McGonagall said, with some edge, and then more quietly, you're 11 years old, Potter. Whatever lordships you hold, you are still 11 years old, and the things you're about to learn in that bank, it's better to hear them with someone. She stopped again. Made a small, precise gesture with her quill. Someone who can be useful. Harry looked at her for a moment. He thought about the way she'd gripped that scroll during the sorting. The way her face had gone white. He thought about what it must be like to have spent decades working alongside Albus Dumbledore, to have believed in him with the absolute trust of someone who had watched him be right so many times that the idea of him being wrong in this particular way was, thank you, he said. And meant it, fully. She nodded, looking back at her papers. 7 o'clock Saturday. The main gate. Don't be late. He wasn't. Saturday morning arrived cold and grey, the kind of early autumn morning that smells like the end of something. Harry was at the main gate at 6:40 with Neville beside him, both of them in their robes, Neville clutching a small notebook that his grandmother had apparently sent him overnight with a note that said simply, write everything down. McGonagall arrived at 6:55 with a clay pot in her hand that she'd apparently repurposed as the portkey and an expression that dared the universe to comment on it. Ready, she said. They touched the pot. The world folded. Diagon Alley at 7:15 in the morning was quiet in a way Harry hadn't seen it during his first visit with Hagrid, shops shuttered, cobblestones empty, the whole place carrying the specific hush of somewhere that will be loud later. Gringotts loomed at the far end, white marble and enormous, the goblins at the top of the steps watching them approach with expressions that managed to convey both professional neutrality and intense personal investment simultaneously. One of the goblins stepped forward as they reached the steps. He was shorter than Harry and radiating more authority than most people Harry had ever met. Lord Potter Peverell, he said, which was startling partly because of the title and partly because of the complete absence of any qualifier, no young in front of it, no hedging, just the straight name and the straight title. I am Grip Hook. Chief Ragnar is expecting you. Your companions. Neville Longbottom, Harry said. His family accounts are also potentially affected. And Professor McGonagall, who is here in an advisory capacity. Griphook looked at McGonagall. McGonagall looked back at Griphook with approximately the same expression she'd deploy on a student she suspected of hiding a fanged frisbee. Something passed between them that was almost like mutual respect. "Professor," Griphook said, and inclined his head slightly. "Griphook," McGonagall said. Inside the bank, they were taken not to the main hall with its rows of teller windows and high vaulted ceiling but through a side door Harry hadn't noticed on his first visit, then down a corridor that was panelled in dark wood and hung with what appeared to be battle tapestries, then into a room that was clearly not an ordinary meeting room. The table was real mahogany. The chairs were high-backed. On the wall was an enormous map of what appeared to be the entire Goblin Tunnel network under Britain, which was considerably more extensive than Harry would have guessed. Ragnarok was waiting. Harry had built a vague expectation in his head on the basis of the letter, formal, powerful, old, and Ragnarok met it and exceeded it simultaneously. He was smaller than Harry had imagined, seated at the head of the table with the particular stillness of someone who has not needed to perform authority in so long that they've forgotten what the performance looks like. His eyes were amber and very sharp and they moved over Harry with the thoroughness of an audit. "Lord Potter Peveril," he said. His voice was deep and slightly gravelled, the voice of someone who only speaks when he has something worth saying. "Sit down." They sat. Griphook took a position near the door. "We'll begin with the audit," Ragnarok said. "Then we'll discuss what it means. Then we'll discuss what you want to do about it." He looked at Neville. "Longbottom. You're here because you're smart enough to be here, so we'll look at your accounts while we're at it." His gaze moved to McGonagall. "Minerva. Good." McGonagall gave a single nod. There was a history in that exchange, some long-standing professional acknowledgement between two people who had navigated the same political landscape for decades, and Harry filed it away. Ragnarok placed his hands flat on the table and a long scroll unrolled in front of Harry. It was covered in fine writing and figures, and at the top, in a script that was old enough to be slightly different from modern English, were the words, "Potter Family Account, Complete Inheritance Audit, Commissioned by Heir Apparent, Date of Majority Claim." "Read the summary at the top," Ragnarok said. Harry read. "The Potter vaults, plural, there were 7, contained, between them, 4.3 million galleons in liquid assets. Enough property deeds to paper a wall, including 2 estates Harry hadn't known about and a set of properties in what the document called the outer settlements that he couldn't place geographically. A collection of magical artifacts spanning roughly 6 centuries. 3 invisibility cloaks, one of which was noted in a separate annotation as a true Deathly Hallow, Cloak of Invisibility, do not confuse with inferior models and starred 3 times. A library of spell books and grimoires that the audit described as extensive and in some cases unprecedented. And a seat, 19 seats, on the Wisengamot, with attached voting rights that had been frozen pending formal lordship claim. Then the second section. Account activity under external management, November 1, 1981 to September 1, 1991. Harry read the numbers. He read them twice. Then he sat back and breathed out through his nose, which was the closest he came to showing what he was feeling. 2,437,000 galleons. The hat had been exact. But the breakdown was worse than the total. Because the total was just a number. The breakdown was a story. The withdrawals were regular. Consistent. The same amounts appearing at the same intervals, monthly disbursements to something listed as the Order of the Phoenix Operational Fund, quarterly payments to a dozen individuals with familiar names from his History of Magic textbook, annual transfers to an account registered to APWB Dumbledore, personal. And then, buried in the footnotes, smaller and irregular, payments to a St. Mungo's long-term care fund that the audit flagged with a small star and the annotation beneficiaries, F, and Longbottom, authorization questionable. Harry looked at Neville. Neville had gone very still. He was looking at the annotation with the expression of someone reading something in a language they understand perfectly but wish they didn't. "The Longbottom account," Ragnarok said, not looking away from Harry, "is a separate matter but a related one. The trust committee that managed it after Frank and Alice Longbottom were incapacitated drew on the account for administrative fees, they called them. 20% per annum. For a decade. The Longbottom fortune has been reduced by approximately 1/3. He paused. The trust committee was chaired by Albus Dumbledore. The room was quiet. I want to claim all 19 lordships, Harry said. Formally. Today. Ragnock inclined his head. We anticipated that. The instruments are prepared. And I want to file a formal grievance against Dumbledore with whoever has jurisdiction. Ministry? Gringotts? Both? Both, Ragnock said. Gringotts has independent jurisdiction over any crime committed against accounts held within its walls. The forgeries on the authorization instruments are a goblin matter as much as a wizard matter. Likely more. His amber eyes were steady and slightly pleased. We take forgery seriously. I imagine you do. The ministry, specifically the DMLE, will need to be notified for the criminal prosecution. Director Bones has already reached out to us. We've been expecting to hear from her for some time. She wrote to me as well, Harry said. I told her I'd speak with her after this. Ragnock made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Good. Now. He produced a second scroll, this one blank, with a quill beside it that looked like it was designed for exactly one purpose. The lordship claim. You'll need to sign and blood seal each house. There are 19. It will take some time. I have time, Harry said. The rings, Ragnock said. You have them with you. Harry reached into his robe pocket. He'd moved them from the box to his pocket that morning, a decision he'd made at 6 in the morning while still half asleep, operating on pure instinct. He set them on the table. 19 rings in a line, different and distinct and impossibly old. Ragnock looked at them. For the first time, his professional neutrality cracked very slightly around the edges, like stone showing the first sign of erosion. Where did you get the rings? It wasn't quite a question. They appeared in my trunk on the night of my sorting, Harry said. In a box I didn't pack. Ragnock looked at Griphook. Griphook said something in gobbledygook. Ragnock responded, brief, sharp, and looked back at Harry. The rings are the true inheritance rings. They were kept in the innermost vault of the Potter estate, Vault 7, which is accessible only to a blood heir holding physical proof of identity. They should not have been able to leave the vault without your explicit presence and instruction. But they did, Harry said. They did, Ragnock agreed. Because apparently the magic has decided that the formalities can follow the substance for once. He picked up the quill and slid it toward Harry. Sign the first line. Then press your right thumb to the seal. Harry signed Harry James Potter and pressed his thumb down. The parchment glowed briefly, a warm gold, and the first ring, plain, old, unmistakably the Potter ring, rose from the table of its own accord, moved through the air, and settled onto the index finger of his right hand like it had been there for years. It was warm. Not uncomfortably, warmly, like a hand around yours. He signed the second line. Peveril. The ring that rose was a band of silver with a faint etching of 3 objects, a stick, a stone, a circle. It settled beside the Potter ring. By the 5th signing, the process had stopped feeling strange and started feeling right, which was possibly stranger. Gryffindor's ring was a ruby-red stone in a simple gold band and it went on his right middle finger, and when it settled Harry felt something shift in his chest the way a door shifts when its hinges are oiled for the first time in years. Slytherin's ring was green and silver and it went on without any fuss, next to Gryffindor's, which should have felt contradictory and somehow didn't. By the time he got to the 19th, Le Fay, a dark band with a stone that shifted color in the light like oil on water, Harry's right hand was covered in rings and his left had taken 3 more and he felt, oddly, lighter. As if each ring had been a weight that became balance once it was placed correctly. Neville's audit was a shorter process but no less significant. Gringotts had its own records of the Trust Committee withdrawals, and the notation in Harry's account about the St. Mungo's Care Fund payments turned out to be only part of it. When all the figures were laid out, Neville looked at them for a long time with his jaw tight and his hands flat on the table. "Can I claim the Longbottom Lordship?" he asked Ragnarok. "You're 11, Ragnarok said, not unkindly. You'd need a guardian's countersignature for formal claim. Your grandmother holds that authority." "My grandmother will sign," Neville said, with a certainty that came from somewhere bedrock deep. "She's been waiting for a reason." "Then we'll prepare the paperwork," Ragnarok said. "She can come in at her convenience." McGonagall, who had been sitting to Harry's left and listening to everything with the focused stillness of someone building a case in real time, said quietly, "Ragnarok. The forged instruments. The authorization papers Dumbledore used to access the accounts. Are they recoverable?" "We have them," Ragnarok said. "Gringotts never discards documentation. They are in a sealed evidence vault. They will be available to the DMLE and, when the time comes, to the Wizengamot." McGonagall nodded. Something in her face had been resolving steadily since they'd arrived, the complicated color shifting, settling into something harder and cleaner. Grief, Harry thought. She had genuinely loved working with Dumbledore. Whatever she was feeling right now was grief doing the labor of accepting a new shape. "One more thing," Harry said to Ragnarok. "The Black accounts. You mentioned the Black Lordship. I hold it in trust," you said, "because Sirius Black named me heir." "Named you heir at the time of your parents' deaths," Ragnarok confirmed. "He did it through Gringotts rather than Ministry channels, which means the imprisonment didn't void it. The Black Vaults are currently frozen pending resolution of the Azkaban situation, but you hold the technical right of heirship. Sirius Black," McGonagall said carefully, "is in Azkaban for crimes is he actually guilty?" Harry asked. The silence had a quality Harry recognized from the previous days, the quality of a question that everyone has been carefully not asking for a very long time. McGonagall looked at him. "The trial record, was there a trial?" Another silence. Longer. "There are Wizengamot records," McGonagall said slowly. "I assumed, I'd like to see them," Harry said. "If they exist." Ragnarok said nothing. His expression said plenty. "I'll look into it," McGonagall said, and something in her voice suggested that she had just added an item to a list that was already uncomfortably long. They were there for 3 hours in total. By the end, Harry had a formally certified copy of the full inheritance audit, sealed with the Gringotts emblem and carrying the weight of independent legal authority. He had 19 rings on his hands. He'd need to figure out how to manage that practically, though Ragnarok had already mentioned that lordship rings could be stored on a holding chain and only produced when formally required. He had a copy of the grievance filing that Gringotts would be submitting to its own internal justice council, separate from the ministry. And he had a key. One specific key, small and dark, which Griphook had pressed into his hand at the door with the words, "Vault 7. Your father's private collection. It has been waiting for you." "What's in it?" Harry asked. "We don't know," Griphook said. "Only a Potter can open it." Harry closed his hand around the key. They took the portkey back to Hogwarts, the clay pot doing its stomach-twisting thing in reverse, and landed in McGonagall's office with the particular graceless stumble of people who'd spent too long sitting and hadn't properly readied themselves. Neville grabbed the bookshelf. Harry landed on his feet from pure reflex. McGonagall set the pot on her desk and stood for a moment with her back to both of them, looking out her window. The castle spread below and around, grey stone in grey morning, Quidditch pitch visible in the distance, the lake dark and still. "I need you both to understand something," she said, still not turning. "What happens from here, the inquiry, the Wizengamot proceedings, anything that results from what we've documented today, it will move slowly. The ministry moves slowly. Even the DMLE, with Amelia Bones at the helm, which is the best possible version of the DMLE, I know it'll be slow," Harry said. "I want to be sure that you," she turned. looked at him with something that was protective and complicated and slightly desperate. "You're a first year. You are here to learn magic. The rest of this, I will help, and others will help, but you cannot allow it to consume your education." Harry looked at her. She meant it, he could see that, meant it with the specific force of someone who thought she'd already failed him once and was drawing a line against failing him again. "I won't let it," he said. And then, because it was true and she deserved to hear it, "I've been waiting my whole life for something to actually be mine. I'm not going to break it by rushing." Something in her expression shifted. She nodded, once, slowly. "Good." Neville, who had been writing in his grandmother's notebook since they'd landed, looked up. "Professor, my gran. Should she write to Gringotts directly, or would it be better if, write to me first?" McGonagall said. "I'll make sure she's directed to the right people." She sent them to lunch. The common room that evening was louder than it had any right to be, the kind of loud that happens when a contained space is full of first years who have been absorbing new information at a rate that exceeds their ability to process it quietly. Ron was explaining something about chess to Dean. Seamus had set fire to a cushion accidentally and was apologizing to it. Hermione was at a table in the corner with 4 books open simultaneously, which was technically impressive. Harry sat down across from her. She looked up immediately, which meant she'd been aware of him entering the room before she made eye contact, which meant she'd been waiting for him, which meant the 4 open books were at least partly a performance of casual preoccupation. "How was it?" she said. "Illuminating." She pushed one of the books aside and leaned forward. "Did Ragnarok actually meet with you personally?" "He did." That's genuinely extraordinary." "He last met personally with a wizard when Folly was minister, which was," she paused to calculate, 43 years ago. "He seemed to think it was warranted." "And the audit?" Harry told her. "Not everything, some of it was private, some of it was Neville's and not his to share without permission, but the broad strokes, the confirmed numbers, the certified documentation, the grievance filing with Gringotts' own counsel." Hermione listened with the focused attention she gave to important texts, her brow drawn slightly inward, and when he was done, she was quiet for a moment. "You know what this means," she said. "Several things. In terms of the Wisengamot, 19 confirmed lordships with certified inheritance records means 19 seats, and some of those seats carry ancient precedence rights. The Peveril seat alone, the most ancient houses get double voting weight in emergency sessions. And if you have all 4 founders' seats, I know. You could call a session," she said. "As lord of an ancient house, you have the right to request an emergency session with 3 days' notice. As lord of multiple most ancient houses you might be able to compress that." "I want to wait," Harry said. Hermione looked slightly frustrated. "The longer you wait, the more time he has to, I know. But I need 2 things first." He held up a finger. "The DMLE meeting with Bones. I want the ministry's official documentation of what they have before I move. Second finger. I need to go back to Gringotts. Vault 7. My father's private collection." Hermione's eyes went sharp with interest. She was visibly trying to temper into professional concern. "What's in Vault 7? "Don't know yet. But you think it's important." "Ragnarok said only a Potter can open it," Harry said. "And Griphook said it's been waiting. Things that wait usually have a reason." She held his gaze for a moment. The fire in the hearth crackled and sent orange light across her face, making her look older, or not older, but more herself, the version that would exist in a few years when the world had had time to teach her what it had to teach. "I want to come," she said. "Next time. To Gringotts. You have no inheritance matters there. I could be useful." She probably could. He thought about it. "All right. But quietly, I can't bring everyone." "Obviously," she said, with a touch of relief in her voice that she immediately covered with a brisk nod. He picked up one of her open books. It was titled Wizarding Inheritance Law and Precedent, 3rd edition. Have you read this whole thing? Most of it. He looked at the spine. It's 412 pages. Some of it's very technical, she said, as if that explained everything, which in her world it apparently did. He put it down. He was about to say something else when Neville arrived from the stairs, holding his grandmother's notebook, with an expression that told Harry the writing had not gone entirely the direction he'd hoped. She wants me to come home, Neville said. He sat down. Just for a day. She wants to see me and have me explain everything in person before she signs anything. That's reasonable, Harry said. McGonagall will have to approve it. I'll talk to McGonagall, Harry said. Neville looked at him with the expression he'd first worn at the sorting, the expression of someone who had been waiting without knowing what they were waiting for, and had recently worked out that this was it. Harry. Why are you helping me? You barely know me. Harry thought about it. Because you asked, he said. And because the same thing was done to you that was done to me, only you didn't have a hat scream it in front of the whole school. You just had your grandmother saying there was less than there should be, for years, with no one listening. He paused. Someone should have listened. Neville looked at the table. Yeah, he said quietly. Fred and George arrived, dropped into adjacent chairs with the synchronized ease of people who'd been sharing space their whole lives, and placed a plate of stolen dinner rolls on the table between everyone. We've been thinking, Fred said. Dangerous, said Hermione, without looking up. Hear us out, George said. You have 19 lordships. That means you have 17 more than a person usually needs. That means you have resources. I know I have resources, Harry said. Specifically, Fred said, leaning in, you have the Gryffindor lordship. Which means you technically have more institutional authority over this house than the head of house. I'm not going to use a family lordship to override McGonagall's house rules, Harry said. The twins looked disappointed and then, immediately, philosophically accepting. Worth a mention, Fred said. Very worth a mention, George agreed. But actually, Harry said, I do want your help with something. They straightened. Identically, like two sunflowers turning to light. Information, Harry said. You know this school. You know its moods, its rhythms, who talks to whom, what flows through the staff corridors and what doesn't. I need to know what's changed since the sorting. What Dumbledore has been doing. Who he's spoken to. Whether anything is moving. The twins exchanged a look. You want us to spy on Dumbledore, Fred said slowly. I want you to notice things you're probably already noticing, Harry said, and tell me what you see. Another look between them, quicker this time, decisive. We're in, George said. Obviously we're in. We were in the moment the hat screamed, we were just waiting for the formal invitation. Don't get caught, Harry said. Harry, Fred said, with absolute genuine offense, we have never been caught. You were caught last year in the astronomy tower with Mrs. Norris, Neville said. Strategically surrendered, George said firmly. Completely different thing. Harry went to bed that night with rings sitting in their holding chain on his bedside table, the vault key under his pillow, and an audit report that could destabilize the entire structure of the Wizarding World's political establishment tucked into a self-locking compartment in his trunk. He lay on his back and thought about Sirius Black. He didn't know the man. He barely knew the name, Godfather, mentioned once by Hagrid in passing, imprisoned for the murder of Peter Pettigrew and 12 muggles in the street. But there'd been no trial. That was the thing. No trial, no proper procedure, just Azkaban and 12 years of being slowly unmade by Dementors, and the account naming Harry his heir, filed through Gringotts where the Ministry couldn't touch it. That wasn't the action of a man who'd done what they said he did. Or maybe it was. Harry had no way of knowing. But the question existed, and it pulled at him the way the vault key pulled at him, the sense of something waiting, something that needed to be opened before you could know what was inside. On Sunday evening, a small owl arrived with a response from the DMLE. Director Bones confirmed the meeting, moved it to the following Saturday to allow Harry adequate time after the Gringotts' visit, and added a single line at the bottom of the letter in handwriting that was slightly different from the rest, as if it had been added after, "I knew your parents. James was a good man. I am sorry this has taken so long." Harry read that line 3 times. Then he folded the letter, and put it with the others, and thought about how strange it was, how strange and how appropriate, that the people who kept telling him they were sorry were the same people who might actually be able to do something about it. He was starting to believe, cautiously, that some of them meant it. Monday arrived with the thundering normality of a school term beginning, and the world contracted to classrooms and corridors and the steep learning curve of first-year magic, which turned out to be genuinely interesting in a way that surprised Harry even though he didn't know why it surprised him. He made a feather levitate on the second try in charms, which made Hermione's eye twitch slightly. He turned a matchstick into a needle in transfiguration that was so precise McGonagall looked at him, and then awarded Gryffindor 5 points without a word, which Fred and George told him later was more meaningful than it sounded because McGonagall typically waited 3 tries before awarding points. In potions, which was in the dungeons and taught by a man whose every quality seemed specifically designed to communicate that you were already disappointing him, Harry found himself the subject of a particular kind of attention. Snape stood over him and asked questions about potions theory that were specifically designed to embarrass, and Harry answered them all, calmly and correctly, because he'd read the textbook twice and had a reasonably good memory. Snape's expression when Harry identified the precise difference between a bezoar and a similar-looking inert stone while maintaining eye contact was briefly and fascinatingly unreadable, some rapid internal recalculation happening too fast to track. He didn't become kind. But he stopped trying to fail Harry, which in Snape's world appeared to be the equivalent of an endorsement. The week passed. Harry learned. He also, in the margins, built things, a network of information, a framework of legal documentation, an understanding of the landscape he was navigating. On Friday night, Fred appeared at his elbow in the common room and said, very quietly, "Dumbledore went to the ministry twice this week. Tuesday and Thursday. We couldn't find out what for. But he came back Tuesday looking like he'd had an argument, and Thursday looking like he'd won one." Harry nodded. "Keep watching." "He also met with Snape on Wednesday," Fred said. "In the office. Long meeting. We don't know what was said but Snape came out and immediately went down to the dungeons and stayed there for an hour." "Interesting," Harry said. And it was. All of it was. The shape of a chess game emerging from noise, pieces moving, positions shifting, a player on the other side who was brilliant and experienced and genuinely believed he was right. Harry looked out the common room window at the dark grounds and thought about what Ragnarok had said, "Come when you are ready. Come soon." Tomorrow was Saturday. He was ready. Chapter 3, The Chamber of Lords. The Ministry of Magic was underground, which Harry thought said something about it, though he wasn't sure what exactly. The visitor's entrance was a red telephone box on a London street that looked like it hadn't made a successful call since 1973. McGonagall dialed the number, 62,442, which spelled magic, which was either charming or embarrassingly on the nose, and the box descended into the earth with a mechanical groan, opening into the atrium like a curtain being pulled back from a stage. Saturday morning. 8:15. The atrium was already moving with ministry workers, robes in various shades of official, voices overlapping, memos folding themselves into paper planes and launching off in directions Harry couldn't follow. A golden fountain stood in the center, a witch and wizard and various magical creatures arranged in a pose of benevolent triumph, that Harry found immediately and specifically unpleasant without being able to articulate why beyond the fact that it looked like something designed by someone who'd never asked any of the creatures what they thought about being arranged that way. McGonagall led them through the security checkpoint, where a bored wizard noted their names with the speed of a man who had stopped reading what he wrote 10 years ago, and then stopped. He looked up at Harry. At his hands, the holding chain was in his pocket, but the Potter ring was on his finger, and the Peverell ring, and the small habit he'd developed of wearing those two at minimum. "Potter?" the wizard said. "Yes," Harry said. The wizard looked at his registry list, then at Harry, then at the list again. "Mr. Potter, the director said to bring you up directly. There's a lift being held for you." McGonagall raised an eyebrow. "Efficient. Director Bones," the wizard said, slightly breathlessly, "has been efficient about this particular matter since approximately 7 o'clock Wednesday morning, sir." They took the lift. Neville, who had come along on the basis that his own inheritance matters were moving through the same channels, stood quietly and watched the floor numbers rise with the expression of someone who had decided to be present and attentive and deal with his feelings about all of this at a later, more private time. Hermione had wanted to come. Harry had told her, gently but firmly, that a first meeting with the director of the DMLE was not the moment to bring his entire support network, and she had accepted this with the controlled frustration of someone who knew it was the right call and hated that it was the right call. The 7th floor. Department of Magical Law Enforcement. The corridor here was different from the atrium, narrower, quieter, the kind of institutional serious that comes from being the place where actual decisions get made, where the decorative optimism of the public-facing floors gives way to something more working-class and purposeful. Amelia Bones's office was at the end of the corridor, which said something too. She wasn't accessible by accident. You had to walk past everything else to get to her, and by the time you arrived, you'd had time to decide whether you still wanted to be there. The door was open. Inside, behind a desk that was large enough to be taken seriously but not so large as to be theatrical, sat a square-jawed witch in her 50s with a monocle and the kind of bearing that comes from 30 years of refusing to let anyone waste her time. She stood when they entered. "Professor McGonagall," she said, and there was warmth in it, the warmth of two people who'd been in the same difficult profession long enough to have a real opinion of each other. "And Lord Potter Peverell." Her eyes moved to Harry with an attention that was direct and respectful and in no way treated him as a child to be managed. "Neville Longbottom." "Director Bones," Harry said. "Thank you for making time." "I've been making time for this since Tuesday," she said, gesturing at the chairs opposite her desk. "Sit down, please." They sat. She sat. She had a file on her desk that was thick enough to be alarming and she put one hand on it without opening it, the gesture of someone who knows exactly what's inside and has decided how to begin. "I'm going to be direct with you," she said, "because I think that's what you're here for and because, frankly, there's been an extraordinary shortage of directness in this situation for a decade." She looked at Harry. "I have the Gringotts grievance filing. I received it Wednesday. I've read it 4 times. And?" Harry said. "And it constitutes sufficient grounds for a formal criminal investigation into Albus Dumbledore for financial crimes against a minor, forgery of magical authorization documents, and misappropriation of accounts held under guardianship." She said it flat, without drama, the way you'd state a fact about weather. "Under normal circumstances, an investigation of this scope against a private citizen would take 6 to 8 weeks to formalize and another month to bring to a preliminary hearing. But," McGonagall said. "But Dumbledore is not a private citizen. He is Chief Warlock of the Wizengamot and Supreme Mugwump of the International Confederation of Wizards, which means the standard investigative procedure creates what is technically an institutional conflict of interest at every level above my office. The Chief Warlock is supposed to chair the tribunal that would try him. The Wizengamot seats he controls through his political alliances represent roughly 40% of the voting body." She paused. "There is no clean path here." "There might be," Harry said. Bones looked at him. "As Lord of the Potter and Peverell seats, I have the right to call an emergency session of the Wizengamot," Harry said. "I understand the most ancient house status compresses the notification period to 48 hours. "Technically correct," Bones said carefully. "And if I call that session, I can request that the Chief Warlock's voting and chairing rights be temporarily suspended pending an investigation. That's procedure under the 1823 Conflict of Interest statute, which has never been used because no Chief Warlock has ever been under investigation, but it exists." He paused. "When the session is called, who takes the chair while Dumbledore's rights are suspended?" Bones was very still. The senior non-conflicted Wisengamot member by years of service. Which is a beat. Griselda Marchbanks. She's 83, she's served for 60 years, she has no political debt to Dumbledore, and she disagrees with him on approximately 70% of policy matters. Perfect, Harry said. Another silence. Bones picked up her quill, set it down. Picked it up again. You're 11 years old, she said. So I keep being reminded, Harry said pleasantly. McGonagall made a sound that might, in other circumstances, have been a laugh. The problem, Bones said, leaning forward, is that calling an emergency session requires the physical attendance of the Lord, or Lady, calling it. You would need to be in the Wisengamot chamber. In session. As an 11-year-old first year at Hogwarts. Is there a law that says lords can't attend sessions during their education? There is no such law, Bones said slowly. Then the only obstacle is procedural and social, Harry said. And I find, recently, that I'm not particularly worried about either of those things. Bones sat back. She was looking at him with an expression that Harry had been seeing with increasing frequency from adults in the last week, an expression he thought of as recalibration, the look of someone who has met an 11-year-old and is quietly scrapping everything they thought 11-year-olds were. I also want to raise the matter of Sirius Black, Harry said. McGonagall straightened. Bones's expression didn't change, which was itself a change. Mr. Black is serving a life sentence in Azkaban for, did he have a trial? Silence. I asked Ragnarok the same question, Harry said. He was also very quiet about it. I then asked Hermione Granger, she's a first year in my year, she reads everything, and she spent 2 days in the Hogwarts library looking for a trial record and found a Wisengamot record of his sentencing, which was apparently passed without a formal trial on the basis of a ministerial emergency order signed by Bartemius Crouch Sr. during the immediate post-war period. Bones closed her eyes for a moment. Just a moment. Then opened them. That is correct. He was sent to Azkaban for 12 years without a trial. Under the emergency protocols active at the time, he was my parents' secret keeper, Harry said. Or he was supposed to be. Except he named me heir through Gringotts before he was imprisoned, which is not the action of a man who just committed the crime they put him away for, and he did it through Gringotts specifically, not through ministry channels, which means either he suspected the ministry couldn't be trusted or someone told him to. Bones was very quiet. I want him investigated, Harry said. Properly. Trial. Evidence. Witnesses. The whole thing, done correctly this time. Harry, McGonagall said. Not cautionary, more the sound of someone steadying themselves against something. He's my godfather, Harry said. He named me heir. He has been in Azkaban for 12 years. If he did it, I want to know for certain. And if he didn't, he let that sit. I want to know that more. Bones looked at her file. At her desk. At the window of her office, which looked out onto another ministry corridor and not the sky, because they were underground and the sky was not available. I will open an inquiry into the Black sentencing, she said finally. Quietly, to begin. I'm not filing anything formally until I know what the evidence actually looks like, because if I file and there's enough political pressure to bury it, I understand, Harry said. Quietly to begin. But moving. Moving, she confirmed. Then, Neville. Your situation. Neville, who had been sitting with his notebook open and a quill in hand, writing in extremely small and precise script, looked up. Yes. Gringotts flagged your family's account in the same filing. The trust committee irregularities. I've seen the figures. My grandmother will be filing a formal claim through Gringotts as soon as we can arrange her visit, Neville said. He'd become more composed over the past week, Harry had noticed, not less anxious, but less uncertain, the difference between a person who is afraid and a person who is afraid but knows what they're doing anyway. And I want the trust committee's accounts audited. All of them. Not just Longbottom, if they were taking 20% from us, they were probably taking it from other families too. Bones wrote something. That's a fair assumption. I'll include it in the initial scope. She looked between them both. Is there anything else? One thing, Harry said. The Wisengamot session. How do I formally call one? Bones reached into her desk and produced a single sheet of parchment with a pre-printed header, Emergency Session Request, Most Ancient and Noble Houses. You fill this in. Sign it with your lordship seal, the Potter ring, pressed to the wax. She slid it across the desk. 48 hours from the moment it's received by the Wisengamot clerk. Harry looked at the parchment. Then at McGonagall. When would be best? McGonagall was quiet for a moment. If you submit today, the session falls Monday morning. That gives us Sunday to prepare. She paused. I'd like to be there. You'll have a seat, Harry said. As my advisor of record, if that's a thing. Under most ancient house precedent, lords may bring counsel, Bones said. It's a thing. Harry filled in the parchment. Neat handwriting, something the Dursleys had accidentally contributed to by insisting on it for the rare occasions he'd been allowed to do homework. He pressed the Potter ring to the wax seal at the bottom, and felt the warmth of the ring pulse once, briefly, a heartbeat, as if confirming, yes, this is mine to do. He handed it back to Bones. She looked at it. Then she did something Harry hadn't expected, she smiled. Not a broad smile, a small, controlled thing, almost private, the smile of someone who has been waiting for a very long time for a specific domino to finally start to fall. Monday morning it is, she said. The Sunday before the session was the quietest day Harry could remember since Hogwarts started, and it was quiet in the way that precedes loud things, the hush of preparation, everyone around him operating at a slightly lower register, conserving something. He spent the morning in the Hogwarts library, reading about the Wisengamot. Not its history, he knew the history, he'd covered it in a week of Hermione-assisted research, but its mechanics. Its procedures. The specific rituals of a formal session, who spoke when, in what order, how challenges were raised, how votes were called. He read like a man learning a battlefield before he walked onto it. Hermione appeared at 10 o'clock, sat across from him without saying anything, and opened the same book she'd had before but to a different chapter. They worked in parallel silence for 2 hours, which was, Harry thought, one of the more comfortable things he'd done since arriving at Hogwarts. At noon she said, without looking up, the Pendragon Lordship. What about it? I was reading about it last night. It's not just a title, it carries a specific kind of ancient magical authority called High Suzerainty, which is essentially the right to summon and preside over multi-house governance proceedings. It hasn't been exercised since the early medieval period, but it's technically still on the books because no one ever formally abolished it. Harry looked up from his book. What does preside mean in that context? It means the Lord holding Pendragon doesn't just have a seat in the Wisengamot. She looked at him now, her expression carefully controlled. They can call the entire body to order and override the chair. The library was quiet. That's not the same as calling an emergency session, Harry said. No. It's considerably more than that. The session I called is under Potter and Peverell authority, standard emergency procedure. But the Pendragon authority is something different. It's a sovereign magical right, not an institutional procedural right. It doesn't require 48 hours notice. It requires what? The Lord's presence and declaration, Hermione said. That's it. You walk in and invoke it and the session is called by the magical architecture of the building itself. Harry sat with that for a moment. Have you confirmed this is real? Not just historical theory. I found 3 separate sources. One is Arcane Governance and Ancient Prerogative by Whitmore Pringle, published 1887. One is a Wisengamot procedural addendum from 1702 that specifically notes the Pendragon suzerainty has never been revoked. The third is, she hesitated, a note in the margin of the 1823 Conflict of Interest statute, in someone's handwriting, that says see also, Pendragon prerogative, supersedes all. Harry closed his book. Someone was thinking about this. Someone always was, she said. The statute was written to have a failsafe. In case the ordinary emergency procedure wasn't enough. Because the ordinary emergency procedure can be disrupted if the right people want to disrupt it. Exactly. He thought about Dumbledore winning an argument at the Ministry on Thursday. He thought about 40% of the Wizengamot and 30 years of political alliance building. I'll use both, Harry said. The Potter Peveril session as the public notice, so no one can say it wasn't done properly. And if anything tries to block it, you walk in and invoke Pendragon, Hermione said. And the building itself calls them to order. She said it with a kind of quiet awe that she was trying to conceal behind scholarly composure, and Harry understood it. It was extraordinary. It was the sort of thing that only existed in old stories, and old laws, and the deeply buried places where the two overlapped. Hermione, he said. Yes. Thank you. For all of this. She looked at him for a moment in the way she sometimes looked at books she was genuinely fond of, with a warmth that she'd probably deny if pressed. I grew up knowing Dumbledore's name the way everyone else did, she said quietly. He's in every book. Every history. He's the reason people like me are safe in this world. She closed her book. I don't enjoy what I've been reading this week. But it's true, and it matters, and truth mattering more than comfort is, it's supposed to be the whole point, isn't it? Of being in Gryffindor. I think so, Harry said. Right then, she said, and opened her book again. Monday morning. McGonagall collected Harry at 7:30. He'd been dressed since 6. He wore his robes but over them, for the first time since Gringotts, the full holding chain of all 19 lordship rings, not on his fingers, but as a cord across his chest under the outer robe, each ring clicking quietly when he moved, a weight that was not heavy so much as it was present. He had the Potter ring and the Peveril ring on his hands. That was enough for visible identification. The rest was there if he needed it. McGonagall looked him over when she arrived. Her gaze went to the chain, understood it, and moved on. Ready? Yes. They flew to the Ministry from her office. The atrium at 8 in the morning was considerably busier than Saturday, the Monday morning of the Ministry, all those official robes and urgent memos, the institutional machinery of the wizarding world at full speed. Several people stopped and stared at Harry and then very deliberately unstared at him in the way of people who are working very hard at being professional. Amelia Bones met them at the entrance to level 9. Behind her were 2 Aurors, not escorting Harry, their body language made clear, but present as witnesses, official and formal. The notification went out yesterday evening, Bones said, walking quickly. Every Wizengamot member has been informed of the emergency session. Standard 48 hours from your filing, which technically means the session can begin at any time today, Harry said. Any time today. We've scheduled 9 o'clock to give members time to arrive. A pause. Dumbledore knows. Of course he does. He sent a communication to the Wizengamot clerk last night requesting that the session be postponed pending. I'll read it directly. She produced a note, proper procedural review of the emergency session request and verification of the requesting lord's legal majority status. His own emergency powers as chief warlock. Yes. Which is precisely the conflict of interest you're invoking the 1823 statute against. She folded the note. Griselda Marchbanks denied the postponement request at 6 this morning. She's already here. Harry felt the warmth of the Potter ring pulse against his finger. He didn't think it was doing it intentionally. He thought it was just responding. The way a compass needle moves without the compass choosing to move. The Wizengamot chamber was on level 10, past the courtrooms where Harry knew, from his reading, that criminal trials were held. But the chamber itself was a different room, larger, older, built in the time when the Wisengamot was not a governmental body but something older and stranger, a council of the most magically powerful families in Britain. That history was in the walls. The stone was very old. The tiered seating rose in a semicircle, with a raised dais at the center, and around the dais were the seats, hundreds of them, most of the ordinary purple chairs, but some along the inner ring a deeper color, and a handful along the innermost ring a black so dark it seemed to absorb the torchlight. Those innermost seats were the most ancient houses. Harry counted them as he walked in. 19. He walked to them without hesitation, because hesitation would be a lie. This was his. The hat had screamed it, Gringotts had documented it, the Wisengamot clerk had accepted it, and whatever anyone thought about an 11-year-old taking his seat among the most ancient institutions in magical Britain, the seat itself seemed to have no objection. When Harry sat in the first black chair, the one marked with a carved letter P for Potter, the stone didn't resist him. The magic of the chamber settled around him like a room acknowledging someone's arrival. Around him, slowly, the chamber was filling. Wisengamot members filed in with varying expressions. Surprise, poorly concealed. Calculation, various kinds. Outrage, from a corner of the purple seats that Harry clocked as probably Dumbledore's most reliable allies. And from a few others, older members, faces he didn't know yet, something that looked like long-deferred relief. Griselda Marchbanks arrived at 8:45 and took the chair. She was, as described, 83, tiny in the way that very old powerful people sometimes become tiny, as if the magic has condensed inward, gotten denser, concentrated. Her eyes were sharp enough to cut glass. She looked at Harry and gave him a nod that was, for Marchbanks, apparently the equivalent of a standing ovation. Dumbledore arrived at 8:52. He was wearing his Wisengamot robes, deep purple, formal, with the Chief Warlock's chain. He walked to his usual seat, the center of the inner ring, and found it occupied not by him but by the 1823 Conflict of Interest statute, which Marchbanks had placed there in the form of a small official placard. He stopped. Looked at the placard. Then looked across the chamber at Harry. Harry looked back. There was a great deal in that exchange. Harry could feel it without being able to fully name it, the full weight of what Dumbledore had expected from him, the contained, supervised, guided version of Harry Potter that had been the plan, carefully cultivated over a decade of letters not sent and vaults not opened in a cupboard under the stairs. And on Harry's side, the clear-eyed understanding of what the man across the room had done and why, the absence of hate, which was important, and the presence of something much more useful. Dumbledore took a seat on the outer ring. His expression was serene. His eyes were not. At 9 o'clock, Marchbanks called the session to order. Emergency session of the Wisengamot, called under most ancient house prerogative by Lord Harry James Potter Peverell, she said, her voice carrying the chamber easily. Lord Potter Peverell has the floor. Harry stood. He'd thought about what he would say. He'd written notes and discarded them, tried several opening lines and found them all wrong, too formal, too aggressive, too soft, too trying to sound old. Then he'd stopped trying to write and just decided to speak, because the truth was the truth and the truth didn't need arrangement. I grew up in a cupboard, he said. The chamber was very quiet. Under the stairs in my aunt and uncle's house in Surrey. That was my room from when I was about 2 until a month ago. There was no heating. There was no window. My cousin's second bedroom had a television and a computer and enough toys to fill the room twice over, and I had a cupboard. He spoke clearly and without emphasis, the way you described facts. I was told, when I asked, that there was no money for anything more. My aunt and uncle aren't wealthy people. That was believable. He reached into his robe and produced the Gringotts audit, the certified, sealed copy, and held it up. This is a formal inheritance audit conducted by Gringotts Bank under the authority of Chief Ragnarok, certified under Goblin law and independently verifiable. It documents the contents of 7 Potter family vaults, the contents of 12 other vaults held under the Potter and associated lordships, and the complete account activity of all those vaults from November 1, 1981, to September 1, 1991. He placed it on the flat surface before his seat. In that period, 2,437,000 galleons were withdrawn from the Potter accounts by the person appointed as my guardian following my parents' deaths. He paused. That person is Albus Dumbledore. The chamber was not quiet now. It was loud and getting louder, voices from every section, some outraged, some disbelieving, some asking rapid procedural questions, and from Dumbledore's corner of the outer ring, a furious sustained murmur that was trying to organize itself into a formal objection. Marchbanks banged the session to order. It took 3 bangs. The chamber quieted. Dumbledore rose. I request the right of, you're conflicted from this proceeding, Albus, Marchbanks said, without particular pleasure. You'll speak when Lord Potter Peverell has finished and the floor opens for formal response. It was, Harry thought, probably the first time in 30 years that anyone had told Albus Dumbledore to sit down and wait. Dumbledore sat. His expression was controlled. His eyes had gone very still, which Harry had come to recognize as the sign that the man was thinking very hard and very fast. Harry continued. He walked through it methodically, the Gringotts records, the forged authorization instruments, the pattern of withdrawals. He named the accounts. He named the amounts. He did not editorialize, because he didn't need to. The numbers were editorial enough. Then he laid out Neville's situation, the trust committee, the 20% administrative fees, the Longbottom and potentially other accounts managed under the same structure. He noted that the trust committee was chaired by Dumbledore. Then he laid out the Black situation. He was careful here, Bones had asked him to be careful, and she was right, because this was the most legally complicated piece and the one where the evidence was most circumstantial. He didn't accuse Dumbledore of arranging the wrongful imprisonment. He stated the facts, no trial, emergency ministerial order, 12 years in Azkaban, and an account naming Harry as heir through Gringotts that predated the imprisonment and had never been revoked. He sat down. The chamber erupted. It took Marchbanks nearly 2 minutes to restore order, and she did it with the calm methodical authority of a woman who had been calling Wisengamot sessions to order since before most of the room was born. When the noise finally collapsed into an edgy, vibrating silence, she looked across to Dumbledore. Albus. You have the floor. Dumbledore rose. And here was the thing about Dumbledore, the thing that made him genuinely dangerous even now, even in this room, even with the audit on the table, he was brilliant. He was the most gifted advocate Harry had ever watched operate, and Harry would not forget that, not even when he was furious at him. He stood in the outer ring with the ease of a man who had been making arguments in this chamber since before Harry was born, and he spoke. He did not deny the withdrawals. He acknowledged them directly, which Harry had not expected, though on reflection it was the right move, since the documentation was airtight. Instead, he constructed a framework. The post-war period. The Order of the Phoenix's operational requirements. The necessity of maintaining resources for the ongoing threat of Voldemort's return. The specific provisions of the emergency war powers that had been in effect in 1981 and the Guardian protocols that had allowed his management of the accounts. I acted, he said, and his voice was measured and warm and sorrowful in precisely the right quantities, in what I believed, and continue to believe, were the best interests of the child entrusted to my care, and of the wizarding world. The withdrawals were documented, the expenditures were purposeful, and the oversight was, I acknowledge, imperfect. I acknowledge that the accounting was not as transparent as it should have been. That is a failing I own. He paused. But Harry Potter is alive. He is safe. He is here. And the world he is safe within exists in part because of the resources that were deployed in the years following the war. It was, objectively, an extraordinary performance. Several members of the outer ring were nodding. Harry waited. The response, Marchbanks said, looking at Harry. Harry stood again. He reached into his robe pocket. Produced the second document, not the audit, but the annotated breakdown that Hermione had helped him prepare, cross-referencing the withdrawals with the publicly documented Order of the Phoenix expenditures for the same period. The Order of the Phoenix, he said, publicly documented expenditures between 1981 and 1991 total approximately 400,000 galleons. The withdrawals from my accounts for the Order Operational Fund total 1,200,000 galleons. That is 800,000 galleons unaccounted for by the purpose stated. He held up the document. Additionally, the 300,000 galleons that went to Dumbledore's personal account were not listed in any order documentation. They are not war expenditure. They are personal enrichment. He let that land. The emergency guardian protocols that Dumbledore cites, he continued, include a specific provision, Section 14, Clause 3, that requires the appointed guardian to provide the ministry with an annual accounting of any funds withdrawn from a ward's estate. I have reviewed the ministry records for the years 1981 through 1991. He looked at Marchbanks. There are no such accountings on file. He sat down again. The chamber had a different quality now. The noise, when it came, was lower, a kind of murmur, the sound of people doing math. Several of the nodding members had stopped nodding. Dumbledore, still standing, said, I would suggest that the appropriate venue for this discussion is not an emergency session but a formal investigative. This is a formal investigative session, Marchbanks said. That's what emergency sessions are. The child does not have the legal majority required to. Which child? Said a voice from the inner ring. Harry turned. The voice belonged to a witch he didn't know, older, dark-skinned, wearing the robes of one of the most ancient houses on the inner ring. Her expression was sharp and she was looking at Dumbledore with the expression of someone who has been waiting for an opportunity. Lord Potter Peverell holds confirmed title to 19 lordships, the majority of which are most ancient houses, she continued. He has a certified inheritance audit from Gringotts and the formal backing of the DMLE. You are suggesting that the lords of the most ancient houses do not have legal majority? On what basis, Albus? Dumbledore looked at her. Then he said, very quietly, Lady Greengrass. The floor has not yielded to you, she said, pleasantly. Marchbanks allowed herself a small pause that was not quite a smile. Lord Potter Peverell. Are you moving for a formal investigative committee? I am, Harry said, standing again. And I am additionally moving, under the most ancient house prerogative, for Albus Dumbledore's chief warlock privileges to be formally suspended pending the investigation's conclusion. Under the 1823 statute, the motion requires a simple majority of the inner ring to pass. He sat. Marchbanks looked around the inner ring. There were 12 members seated there. Including Harry, which was unprecedented, probably, and she knew it, and she was letting it stand, because the law was the law and it had been the law since before either of them existed. Those in favor of suspending the chief warlock's privileges pending investigation, she said. 8 hands rose. Including Harry's. Including Lady Greengrass. Including 2 members Harry didn't know yet but intended to learn. Including a very old wizard in the corner of the inner ring who raised his hand with the unhurried confidence of someone who has been waiting 40 years for this specific motion. Marchbanks surveyed the hands. The motion carries. Dumbledore was very still. The investigative committee will be constituted as follows, Marchbanks continued, and Harry understood that she'd had this ready, that she'd been ready since 6 this morning, possibly since 30 years ago when she'd first started watching and wondering. Director Bones of the DMLE as lead investigator. Lord Potter Peverell as petitioning lord. Lady Greengrass as inner ring oversight. Chief Ragnarok of Gringotts as, she paused, independent financial auditor, operating under Gringotts's own judicial authority. Another pause. And myself. She looked at Dumbledore. Her expression was not unkind. It was the expression of someone who has enormous respect for a person and is doing what respect requires. Albus, she said. Do you understand the proceedings? Dumbledore was quiet for a long moment. His hands were very still on the top of the outer ring railing. His face was composed. Then he said, with the courtesy of a man who has never once in his life been graceless in defeat, I understand, Griselda. Perfectly. He sat down. The session was adjourned 40 minutes later after the formal constituting of the committee, the assignment of timelines, and a procedural argument about evidentiary standards that Harry let Marchbanks and Bones handle because they were both better at it than he was. He was walking out of the chamber when a voice behind him said, Lord Potter Peverell. He turned. Lady Greengrass was walking toward him, tall, composed, watching him with the expression of someone who had recently revised their expectations and was still integrating the revision. Her robes were expensive but not showy, the kind of wealth that expresses itself through quality rather than volume. I don't believe we've formally met, she said. Augusta Greengrass. Harry Potter, he said. Thank you. For the floor. The floor was yours, she said. I merely declined to let it be taken from you. She studied him. You're Lily Evans's boy. I knew your mother, briefly, before she married. She was extraordinary. A pause. You seem to have inherited that. Harry looked at her. He knew the Greengrass family name from his reading, Old Family, political moderates, generally aligned with neither the Death Eater camp nor the Dumbledore camp, which made them rarer and more valuable than either. Would you be willing to meet? In the next few weeks. I'd like to understand the inner ring better. The relationships, the history. She raised an eyebrow. You're asking to be educated. I'm asking to understand the board, he said. Something moved in her expression, approval, maybe, or the precursor to it. Send an owl, she said. My family's manor, Tuesday evenings. She paused at the door. Bring the Granger girl. I've heard she's sharp. Then she was gone. McGonagall appeared at Harry's shoulder. She'd been watching the session from the gallery and she had the look of someone who had spent the morning experiencing a complicated mixture of emotions at high volume and had arrived at something like peace on the far side of it. Ready to go back, she said. Yes, Harry said. They walked through the corridor. Past the courtrooms. Past the things that waited inside them, the small dark history of the wizarding world's attempts at justice, not always successful. Harry thought about Sirius Black in a cell that these corridors led to, or led from, 12 years ago, led to without stopping for a trial, without stopping at all, because someone with authority over the appropriate channels had decided that the channels didn't apply. He thought, we're coming. Not a promise to anyone outside himself. Not yet. Just the internal acknowledgement of a direction. They took the lift back to the atrium. The fountain stood in the center, witch and wizard and arranged creatures. Harry looked at it as they passed and thought that when this was over, all of it, when the committees were done and the verdicts were in and the accounts were audited and the truth was the official record, he'd like to see it replaced with something else. Something more honest about what the world actually was. Something that didn't pretend the arrangement was voluntary. The portkey back to Hogwarts took them home in a breath, landing them in McGonagall's office with the smell of cold morning air and something like possibility. Harry put the Potter ring to his lips, not consciously, and then felt slightly foolish for it, but the ring was warm and so he let it be. Chapter 4, Old Debts and New Alignments. 3 weeks into term and Hogwarts had developed opinions about Harry Potter. This was not unusual. Hogwarts had developed opinions about Harry Potter before he arrived, when he was still a name on a list and a legend in the corridors, but the opinions had shifted since the sorting, and they had shifted again since the Wisengamot session, and they kept shifting in the way that opinions do when the person thereabout refuses to stay the shape you assigned them. The Gryffindors had adopted him with the uncomplicated loyalty of a house that values nerve above everything else and had watched him demonstrate it spectacularly on his first night. The Ravenclaws watched him with academic interest that occasionally bordered on fascination. The Hufflepuffs, whose collective instinct for fairness had been thoroughly activated by the story of a boy raised in a cupboard while his inheritance was plundered, were warm in a way that cost them nothing and meant quite a lot. Susan Bones had taken to sitting near him at interhouse study tables, and while she never mentioned her aunt directly, Harry understood the gesture. The Slytherins were the interesting ones. Not hostile, that was the thing, that was what everyone expected and what didn't quite materialize. A few of the Slytherin first years had made the standard early attempts at hierarchy establishment, but they'd stopped after about a week, partly because Harry never reacted the way they expected and partly because word had filtered down from the upper years that Lord Potter Peverell also held the Slytherin lordship, which created a political situation that the Slytherin common room was still in the process of reckoning with. And then there was Draco Malfoy. Draco had been watching Harry from a careful distance since the sorting. Not the sneering surveillance of someone looking for weaknesses, something more calculated, more patient. Harry had noticed it and let it sit, because he understood instinctively that Draco Malfoy would come to him when he'd worked out what he wanted to say, and forcing the conversation before that would just make it harder. He came on a Tuesday evening, 3 weeks and 2 days into term, when Harry was alone in an alcove off the third-floor corridor with a book about goblin metallurgy that Ragnarok had sent him. For background, the covering note had said, which Harry had interpreted as "You're going to need this soon." Draco appeared at the entrance to the alcove and stood there in a way that was trying to be casual and not quite managing it. He was in his school robes, no entourage, no Crabbe, no Goyle, who were usually arranged on either side of him like decorative columns. "Malfoy," Harry said, without looking up. "A beat. Potter. Do you want to sit down or are you going to stand there until one of us dies of old age?" Draco sat down. He arranged himself carefully, back straight, the posture of someone who'd been taught since infancy how to occupy a chair with dignity. He put his hands on the table and said, "My father wants to meet with you." Harry closed his book. "Your father?" "He says, I'll give you the exact words because frankly they confused me too, he says that the current political realignment creates an opportunity for houses that have historically been on opposing sides to establish more productive frameworks of cooperation." Draco's expression was that of someone quoting something they find slightly embarrassing. His words. What does that mean in plain English? It means he was on the wrong side of the last war. He spent 2 years after it explaining that he was under an imperious curse. He has been politically dependent on Dumbledore's goodwill not to revisit that explanation, and Dumbledore's goodwill just became considerably less reliable. Draco's voice was very flat. "And so he wants to see which way you're pointing before he decides where to stand." Harry looked at him. "You're being very direct about that." "You'd find out eventually," Draco said. "You seem to find things out." A pause. He was looking at the book Harry had closed, Goblin Metallurgy and Inheritance Instruments, 3rd edition, with an expression of someone adding a data point. "And I've worked out that you're not easily managed with the usual approach, so." The usual approach being? Appeal to status, frame everything as mutual benefit, keep the real request for the third meeting. He said it completely without self-consciousness, the way you describe a recipe. "It works on most people." Harry tilted his head. "Does it work on you?" "I invented it," Draco said. "On me it works until I realize I'm doing it to myself, which takes embarrassingly long sometimes." A pause. "My father is not a fool. He's a careful man who made a catastrophic choice and has been managing the consequences for 10 years. He genuinely wants an alliance with you." "What would the alliance look like?" "Politically, Malfoy block votes in the Wisengamot aligning with Potter positions. There are 8 seats between our various family connections, not all of them most ancient, but some of them." He'd clearly thought about this. Memorized it, even. Financially, some of the properties that were diverted from the Potter estates in the post-war period. My father knows where several of them ended up. He might be persuaded to provide documentation. Harry was quiet for a moment. "Why are you telling me all of this? You could have just relayed the meeting request." Draco looked at the table. Something moved across his face, quickly, barely visible, the kind of expression that happens before a person decides to say a true thing. Because if my father is going to do this, I want it to be real. Not just another Malfoy repositioning. He does that. A pause. I'd rather be someone who actually chose. Harry looked at him for a long moment. He thought about Draco on the train, the extended hand, the condescension, the assumption that Harry would slot neatly into the hierarchy Draco had prepared for him. He thought about the week since, the watching, the silence, the careful accumulation of understanding. He thought, this is what people look like when they're trying to be better than what they were handed. He knew something about that. I'll meet your father, he said. Hogsmeade weekend, 3rd of November. Public place. Madame Pudafoots is too small and conspicuous, the 3 broomsticks is better. Noon. Draco blinked. You already know the Hogsmeade schedule. I know most schedules. It's useful. Harry reopened his book. Tell your father, no imperious discussion, no revisionist war history. I'm not interested in how things were explained. I'm interested in what he can do now. Draco stood. He was quiet for a moment, not awkward, just processing. Then he said, he'll say yes. I know he will. Draco walked away, and Harry tracked him with peripheral vision until he turned the corner, then went back to the book about goblin metallurgy, which was considerably more interesting than people generally assumed. The thing about learning magic was that it rewarded attention in a way that school at the Dursleys had never quite managed. At the Dursleys there had been an implicit understanding, never spoken, never needed to be, that Harry shouldn't do too well. Top marks attracted attention, attention invited comparisons with Dudley, comparisons with Dudley ended badly. So Harry had learned to be good enough and no more, which had been, in its own way, excellent training for a kind of strategic underperformance that he no longer had any interest in. At Hogwarts he had no reason to be anything less than what he was, and what he was turned out to be, at least in terms of practical magic, somewhat alarming. Not in every subject. Potions was technical and required a kind of careful precision that he could achieve but that Hermione achieved more naturally, the way some people have a sense for cooking. History of magic was delivered by a ghost who appeared to be reciting from a text he'd memorized before he died and couldn't quite remember why, and Harry learned it from books instead. Astronomy required patience he had in theory if not always in practice. But in Transfiguration, in Charms, and most unexpectedly in Defense Against the Dark Arts, something happened that Harry could only describe as recognition, the feeling of doing something that made sense to him the way a native language makes sense, below the level of translation. In defense class on a Thursday in mid-October, Quirrell set them a theoretical exercise involving counterjinx identification. Harry finished in about 8 minutes and found himself looking at the rest of the work, which was a collection of interesting follow-on questions, and answering those too, not because anyone had asked him to but because the questions were interesting. Quirrell came to stand over his desk near the end of class and looked at the parchment. His expression was difficult to read, it was always difficult to read, covered as much of it was by the turban, but there was something in the quality of his attention that made the back of Harry's neck prickle. Not in the way a good thing prickles. In the way a warning prickles. Mr. Potter, he said. Impressive. The stutter that characterized his speech in general was absent on that word. Just for that word. Thank you, Professor, Harry said. You've gone beyond the set material. The follow-on questions were on the parchment, Harry said. I assumed they were part of the exercise. They were optional. Oh, Harry said, looking at the parchment with an expression of mild surprise that he did not entirely mean. I'll remember that. Quirrell moved on. Harry watched him go and thought about the way he'd stood over the desk, not the way a teacher stands over a student's work to assess it, but the way someone stands when they're reading something they want and have decided to pretend they're not interested in. He mentioned it to Fred and George that evening, briefly, as a data point to add to their collection. Quirrell, Fred said thoughtfully. Peculiar fellow, George agreed. More peculiar than we thought, maybe, Fred said. Because he used to be, Prefect Weasley would know, actually. Harry found Percy in the common room and asked, with sufficient directness that Percy had no time to organize a deflection, whether he knew anything about Quirrell's history. Percy, who was deeply uncomfortable with anything that might involve criticizing a staff member but more uncomfortable with being evasive to someone who had, in 3 weeks, fundamentally altered his understanding of institutional authority, said that Quirrell had been the Muggle studies teacher before taking defense, that he'd gone traveling the year before to get first-hand experience with dark forces, and that he'd come back significantly changed. Changed how? Harry said. Percy thought about it. Nervous, he said finally. He wasn't nervous before. He was, ordinary, honestly. Pleasant. Now he's, jumpy. The turban is new. He claims it was a gift from an African prince who he helped vanquish a zombie. George doesn't believe the story about the zombie. George is probably right, Harry said. Percy looked like he wanted to ask a follow-up question and had decided, wisely, not to. Harry filed Quirrell under monitor closely and went to bed. The attack came on a Friday night in early November, 11 days before the Hogsmeade visit. Harry was walking back from the library at 9:30, technically within curfew but at its edge, having spent 2 hours cross-referencing Wisengamot voting records with family lineage charts that Hermione had somehow obtained from the restricted section, which was a question he'd decided not to ask, and tracing the network of political obligations around Dumbledore's block. He was on the 5th floor, in a corridor lit by torches that were running low, and he heard the footstep half a second before the spell. The half-second was enough. He dropped sideways, pure reflex, something that lived below the level of conscious decision, and the yellow jet of light passed close enough to his shoulder that he felt the heat of it. The stunner hit the stone wall behind him and left a scorch mark the size of a fist. Harry came up from the drop already moving, and he had his wand out, and he turned to face the direction the spell had come from. The corridor was empty. Or appeared to be empty. He'd read about disillusionment charms. Hadn't used one yet, too advanced for first year, but he'd read about them, and the shimmer of disturbed air was there if you knew what you were looking for, a column of near invisibility about 20 feet ahead of him, moving toward the stairs. He pointed his wand and said, very clearly, Finite Incantatem. The charm dropped like a coat being shed. The person underneath it was a 6th-year Slytherin he recognized from the corridors, Marcus Flint's year, one of the outer edges of the Quidditch captain's social circle. His name was Avery, and he was looking at Harry with an expression caught between aggression and the dawning comprehension that something had gone wrong with the plan. They regarded each other for a moment. Avery, Harry said. Avery raised his wand again. Harry said, Expelliarmus. He said it with the easy certainty of someone who had practiced it and practiced it and practiced it in the empty space behind his curtained bed at 11 at night until the motion was as natural as breathing, and Avery's wand flew in a clean arc and Harry caught it left-handed without looking away from Avery's face. How did you? Avery started. Whose idea was this? Harry said. Avery's jaw tightened. He was a big 6th year and he was looking at an 11-year-old who was holding his wand and had just stripped him of it in 2 words, and the combination of those facts was doing something complicated to his face. You can't prove, I don't need to prove it to anyone tonight, Harry said. I'm asking you directly. Whose idea? Silence. Here's the thing, Harry said, and his voice was conversational, the voice he used when he wanted to be heard clearly and had no interest in performance. You can tell me now and I'll take you to McGonagall and that's the end of it, for you at least. Or you cannot tell me, and I'll take you to McGonagall anyway, and then I'll find out through other channels, and by the time I find out you'll have had a month to live with the knowledge that you protected someone who sent you to curse a first year in a dark corridor and didn't even bother to stay and watch. Avery looked at the floor. He said you'd been looking into things you shouldn't, Avery said. That you were going to damage the school. That Dumbledore's been, that he's being treated unfairly and someone with sense needed to do something about it. Who is he? A pause. Then, Flint. But Flint doesn't, it wasn't his idea originally. He said it came down from somewhere above him. He didn't say who. Somewhere above him, Harry repeated. That's all I know. Harry looked at him for a long moment. Then he held out the wand. Avery stared at it. "Take it," Harry said. "We're going to McGonagall's office and you're going to tell her everything you just told me. And then I'm going to tell Marcus Flint that his errand didn't accomplish anything, which he already knows, and that the next person sent to curse me in a corridor will have a considerably worse night than you've had." He paused. "Any questions?" Avery took his wand. His expression had moved through several configurations and arrived at something that looked like exhausted relief, the relief of someone who'd been afraid of the plan from the start and was glad it was over. McGonagall's response, when they arrived at her office, was controlled fury of the specific temperature that only Scottish women of a certain generation can achieve, cold enough to sting, precise enough to burn. Avery received a month's detention and the loss of 50 Slytherin points, which caused a political earthquake in the Slytherin common room that Fred and George reported on with gleeful detail over the following days. Marcus Flint had no public consequences, because Harry had no proof that connected him directly and he had no interest in making accusations he couldn't document. But the morning after the corridor incident, Harry passed Flint in the entrance hall and looked at him for exactly 3 seconds, not threatening, not angry, just clear, the look of someone who knows exactly what you did and has logged it carefully and intends for you to know they've logged it, and watched Flint's face do something very unpleasant under that attention. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. Lucius Malfoy walked into the Three Broomsticks at noon on a Saturday with the practiced ease of a man who knows exactly how much space he takes up in a room and has decided it's precisely the right amount. He was tall, pale, silver-haired in the way that had once been blonde, and immaculately dressed in robes that walked the line between wizarding formality and something more archaic, the robes of old money, old blood, old loyalty to old things, some of them good and some of them definitively not. He carried a cane he didn't need, which Harry had already understood from his reading was the kind of aristocratic affectation that was itself a kind of statement, "I can afford not to need things I carry." He saw Harry and stopped. The stop was almost imperceptible, a fraction of a second, the adjustment of expectation to reality, and then he crossed the room and sat down across from Harry with the ease of a man resuming something he'd already been doing. Draco was not with him. That was intentional, Harry suspected, on Lucius's side, to keep the conversation clean, or on Draco's side, because Draco had made a choice to stay out of it and was letting the adults manage themselves. McGonagall was at the bar, a glass of something amber in front of her, reading the Prophet with the focused attention of someone who was absolutely not listening to the conversation at the table in the corner. Rosmerta brought 2 butterbeers and disappeared. Lucius looked at Harry across the table with eyes that were calculating in the practiced way of a man who had spent his life calculating and did it as naturally as breathing. "Lord Potter Peverell," he said. The voice was smooth and patrician and gave nothing away. "Mr. Malfoy," Harry said. "Your son delivered your message accurately." "He's perceptive," Lucius said, with a warmth that was genuine. Harry thought, whatever else Lucius Malfoy was, he appeared to genuinely love his son. "More perceptive than I was at his age." "He's also direct," Harry said. "Which I appreciate. So let's match it." He wrapped his hands around the butterbeer. "You want to align with the Potter block in the Wizengamot. You want to provide documentation of diverted Potter properties. In exchange, you want political cover, specifically, you want whatever goodwill I'm building in the Wizengamot to make the Malfoy block's reintegration into respectable politics easier." Lucius was quiet for a moment. "Then, that is one way to describe it. What's another way?" "The Malfoy family has interests that are best served by a stable, well-governed wizarding Britain," Lucius said. "The current instability, the Dumbledore situation, the investigation, the questions about account management and the trust committee, creates risks for everyone with significant Wizengamot holdings. I prefer the risks to resolve in a direction that involves functional institutions and a lord who understands the complexity of old family politics." "And not a lord who might decide that old families are the problem," Harry said. A slight inclination of the head. "You hold Slytherin's lordship. You hold Gryffindor's. You are, politically speaking, the one person in this generation who can occupy all positions simultaneously without contradiction. That is an extraordinary advantage and an extraordinary responsibility. He looked at Harry with what appeared to be genuine appraisal. I want to be useful to the person who holds that position. Not servile. Malfoys are not servile. Useful. There's a difference, Harry acknowledged. What properties? Lucius reached into his robe and produced a folded document. He placed it on the table without sliding it across. 4 properties. The manor at Godric's Hollow, not your parents' cottage, that was destroyed in 1981, but the original Potter Manor built in the 17th century, which was quietly transferred to a shell account during the post-war chaos. A library in Edinburgh, 5 floors, pre-Hogwarts texts, been sitting empty since 1982. 2 investment properties in Diagon Alley that have been generating rent that has been going into the shell account. He paused. I know who controls the shell account. I can provide the documentation. Harry didn't touch the document. Why do you have this information? Lucius met his gaze. Because when the wars ended and the dust settled, there were a great many people who knew where a great many things had gone. Information is currency, Lord Potter Peveril. I have been holding this particular currency for a decade waiting to understand its best use. And its best use is now. Its best use is you, Lucius said simply. The investigation committee is constituted. The evidence is building. Whoever provides documentation in this process is on the right side of what comes next. I have always preferred the right side, when I could identify it clearly enough. Harry thought about this. He thought about the Death Eater who had claimed Imperius. He thought about the man who'd sent people to do what Voldemort asked of them, and whether that man was also the man sitting across from him now, and whether those were the same man or whether people were complicated enough that they could be both things without either one cancelling the other out. He didn't forgive it. He wasn't asked to forgive it. That wasn't what was on the table. What was on the table was a choice, and the choice was, use what's available, or be pure and be outmaneuvered. The documentation, Harry said, goes to Director Bones. Not to me, directly to the DMLE, with your name on it and your signature on the covering letter. That's the condition. Lucius was very still. That creates a formal record. Yes, Harry said. That's the point. If you want political cover, Mr. Malfoy, it comes from doing the right thing publicly. Not from doing it in a room where no one else can see. He paused. That's how cover actually works, in the long run. A long moment. The pub was warm and loud around them, students and Hogsmeade visitors generating the cheerful noise of a Saturday, and in the corner 2 of the most politically significant people currently active in Wizarding Britain were sitting with their butterbeers and deciding what kind of world the next decade was going to be. Lucius picked up the document. Looked at it. Then placed it back on the table, this time sliding it across to Harry. I'll send a duplicate to Director Bones by Monday, he said. With my signature and a covering letter. Harry picked up the document. Appreciated. One more thing, Lucius said. He said it lightly, carefully, the way you place something fragile on a surface. The Dark Lord. Harry looked at him. He is not gone, Lucius said. Whatever the official record says. Whatever people have chosen to believe for 11 years. He is not gone. And when he returns, a pause, the pause of a man confronting something that frightens him, he will come for you first. And second, he will come for everyone who has recently and publicly aligned with you. Are you asking me for protection? Harry said. I am providing you with honest information, Lucius said. What you do with it is your business. Harry held his gaze. I know he isn't gone, he said. I've known since September. He didn't elaborate. He watched Lucius process that, watched the calculation shift. When the time comes, Mr. Malfoy, I'll deal with it. I always have. He said it without drama, without swagger, the same way he'd identified the counterjinx in Quirrell's class, because it was true, and the truth didn't require decoration. Lucius looked at him for a long moment. The calculating eyes did something they hadn't done since Lucius sat down. They went uncertain, briefly, the uncertainty of a man who has just encountered something he hadn't fully modeled. "Yes," he said, very quietly. "I believe you will." They finished their butterbeers. Lucius left with the crisp efficiency of a man who has accomplished what he came for. McGonagall appeared at Harry's table about 30 seconds later, sat down, and looked at the document in Harry's hand. "Well," she said. "For properties and documentation of the shell account," Harry said. "He'll file with Bones Monday." McGonagall picked up her amber drink and finished it. "I taught him," she said. "Lucius Malfoy. 30 years ago." She set the glass down. "He was clever then. Ambitious. The war gave that ambition a very bad direction." She was quiet for a moment. "You handled that well." "He's not redeemed," Harry said. "I haven't forgiven him for anything. I don't know that I need to." "No," McGonagall said. "But you might have made him useful, and useful is available in a way that redeemed often isn't." She looked at him with the expression that he was slowly coming to understand was her version of warmth, not soft, not demonstrative, just present and real. "Your father would have punched him." Harry grinned. It surprised him. "Yeah." Immediately and without discussion. "That's also a valid approach." "It is," she said. "But yours gets you the document." Severus Snape stopped Harry in the corridor the following Monday morning. Not aggressive, not the setup for a humiliation exercise, which was what Harry had half expected and half prepared for. Just, appeared beside him between transfiguration and charms, fell into step, and said in a tone that was stripped of everything except information, "The corridor incident. 3 weeks ago." "Avery," Harry said. "Yes. You were told it came from above Flint." "I was." "Flint takes instruction from 2 people," Snape said. They were walking, neither of them looking at the other, the conversation conducted in the sideways register of people who don't want it overheard. "One of them is obvious. The other is not." Harry waited. "There are individuals who believe the current investigation represents a threat to structures they have spent a very long time building," Snape said. "Not all of them are as obvious as Flint's circle. Some of them have excellent reasons to present themselves as neutral." A pause. "I am telling you to watch for people who appear not to have chosen a side. Because in this particular game, everyone has chosen a side. The people who appear neutral have merely chosen not to show you which one." Harry looked at him sideways. "Why are you telling me this?" Snape was quiet for several steps. "Your mother," he said, and stopped. And then, "I am telling you this because it is correct and because someone should and because I am better served by a world in which the truth of what was done to your family is on record than by a world in which it is not." He said it without warmth, without the smoothness of someone making an alliance offer. It sounded, in fact, like a man saying something he'd been arguing himself into for weeks and had finally gotten to the far side of. "Thank you," Harry said. "Don't," Snape said. "I'm not, this is not," he stopped again. A complicated expression crossed his face, gone quickly. "Just watch the neutral ones." He peeled off into a side corridor and was gone. Harry stood for a moment in the main corridor and thought about a man who had loved his mother and spent 20 years in the wreckage of that and was now, in his own way, in the only language available to him, trying to do something that balanced an account it was too late to fully balance. He filed it. He'd think about it later. For now there was charms, and then lunch, and then a letter from Augusta Longbottom that Neville had brought to him that morning with shaking hands and a face that was trying not to show what it felt, and which said, in Augusta's forthright hand, "I have been to Gringotts. I have seen the numbers. I have signed the claim. I am coming to the Wisingamot next session and I am bringing the evidence about the trust committee and there will be a reckoning. My son would have wanted this. My daughter-in-law would have wanted this. I am glad you exist, Harry Potter. Don't waste it. He'd read it twice and handed it back to Neville, who had folded it very carefully and put it in his breast pocket, close. There was a letter from Ragnarok too, arriving the same morning by the tawny owl he'd come to recognize as Gringotts's official bird. It was brief. It said that the forensic accounting of the forged authorization instruments was complete, that the forgeries had been traced to a specific enchanting method that Gringotts had identified as consistent with instruments made circa 1979 using techniques known to, and here the letter was direct in the way only Ragnarok could be, 7 living wizards, one of whom is Albus Dumbledore and 6 of whom we are currently locating. He read that one to Hermione at lunch. She set down her fork. 7 living wizards. That's, Ragnarok is saying that the forgery itself is traceable evidence. Not just that the accounts were accessed irregularly, but that the instrument that authorized the access was constructed by a specific person using a specific technique. Yes. That's not financial crime anymore, she said. That's premeditated fraud. The distinction matters in wizarding law because financial crime carries a fine and restitution, Harry said. Premeditated fraud against a minor's estate carries imprisonment. Hermione looked at him. You already knew that. I read the statutes, he said. She picked up her fork again. Stared at her plate. Then said, quietly, do you actually want him imprisoned? Harry thought about it honestly, which was what the question deserved. I want the truth on record, he said. I want the accounts restored. I want Sirius Black out of Azkaban if he's innocent. I want the Longbottom accounts restored, and the other families that were touched by the trust committee. I want the Wisengamot to function without someone's thumb on it. A pause. If imprisonment follows from the evidence, then it follows. I'm not going to stand in front of it. But I'm also not, it's not what I want for its own sake. Hermione nodded slowly. I think that's the right answer. You think? I'm still working out what the right answer is, she said honestly. He did a lot of good. Real good. Real things that exist because he existed and did them. And he also did this. She shook her head. I don't know how to hold both of those things. Neither do I, Harry said. I think that might be the point of it. She looked at him. What do you mean? I mean that easy things don't need to be held carefully, he said. The hard ones do. You hold them both, and you let each one be true, and you decide what to do with the whole of it. He picked up his pumpkin juice. You don't have to be finished yet. This isn't done. She was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded, once, and went back to her lunch, and her expression was the expression of someone who was carrying something heavy but had found, at least for the moment, a way to carry it that didn't require putting it down. Outside the tall windows the November sky was low and white with the specific promise of the first real cold, and somewhere in the corridors above them Quirrell was teaching his next class, and somewhere in the castle Dumbledore was managing his diminished authority with the skill of a man who had always known this shape of the game, and somewhere under the bank in London Ragnarok was building a case as methodical and certain as stonework. Harry ate his lunch. He had charms in 20 minutes, and he was looking forward to it, which was itself a remarkable fact, the simple ordinary remarkable fact of being somewhere and looking forward to the next thing, of having a future that was his own and running toward it without looking over his shoulder. He was 11 years old. He was not afraid of anything. And that, more than the rings or the Gringotts records or the Wisengamot vote, was the thing that was going to matter most. Chapter 5, The Trial of Albus Dumbledore. The trial was set for the 14th of December. Bones had pushed for it. The evidence, she'd written to Harry in the second week of November, was complete enough to proceed, the Gringotts forensic accounting, the forged authorization instruments, the Malfoy documentation of the diverted properties, the trust committee audit that now implicated 7 additional families beyond Longbottom, and the ministry's own records confirming that no annual accounting of ward estate withdrawals had ever been filed by Dumbledore in 10 years of guardianship. She'd also, in a separate and notably shorter letter, told him that the inquiry into Sirius Black's imprisonment had turned up something significant. She didn't say what. She said she'd have it ready for the trial date. Harry had read that letter 3 times and put it in the locked compartment of his trunk and not mentioned it to anyone except McGonagall, who had received her own version of it and gone very quiet and spent an evening in her office that Harry suspected involved a great deal of scotch and a great deal of thinking about the past. November moved fast, the way November does when you're busy. Harry learned to ride a broomstick, which turned out to be the thing that felt most native to him, more native even than combat magic, the feeling of altitude and speed and no ceiling above him, just air and sky and the whole enormous world spread below, not threatening but available. McGonagall watched his first lesson from the ground and afterward spoke to Madame Hooch in a low voice, and a week later Harry received an invitation to try out for the Gryffindor Quidditch team, which Oliver would extended with the intensity of a man delivering scripture. He made the team as seeker. He was the first year in a century, which Fred and George celebrated by commissioning a banner they absolutely should not have had time to make. He also received, in the 3rd week of November, a parcel from an unknown sender. No return address, no note. Inside, wrapped in plain brown paper, was the most extraordinary object he'd ever held, a cloak that wasn't quite silver and wasn't quite white and fell through his fingers like water, and when he draped it over his hand disappeared. He sat on his bed and held the invisibility cloak and thought about his father, who had owned this, and who had perhaps wrapped it around himself in exactly this way and sat on a bed somewhere and thought about what to do with it. The Vault 7 key was still in his trunk, unused, he hadn't been back to Gringotts since the audit, and the private collection was waiting, patient as everything old is patient. He'd go after the trial. He'd promised himself that. First things first. He tucked the cloak away and went to Charms. The night before the trial, Harry couldn't sleep. Not from anxiety, or not primarily. More the way you can't sleep before something significant when the significance keeps the mind active and running, turning over details, checking and rechecking the shape of what was coming. He lay in the dark dormitory and listened to Ron's easy snoring and Neville's quieter breathing and the low wind off the mountains outside the window, and sometime around 2 in the morning he got up, put on the invisibility cloak, and went walking. The castle at night was a different thing entirely. Not frightening, stranger than frightening, the strangeness of a place that has its own life when no one is performing being in it. Portraits sleeping. Suits of armor standing in the particular stillness of things that are very old and very good at waiting. The staircases moving on their own slow logic. He ended up, without quite meaning to, outside a door on the 3rd floor corridor that had a faint warmth coming through it, not heat exactly, but the sense of something present and alive that he'd learned, over the past months, to pay attention to. He stood outside the door for a moment. Then he kept walking, because he had enough to manage without adding whatever was behind that door to the list. He filed it, one more thing to come back to, after the trial, after Vault 7, after the horizon line of immediate things that kept requiring his attention. He walked back to the dormitory and sat in his bed and thought about Dumbledore. He thought about a man who had genuinely made the world safer and had, in the process of doing it, decided that his own judgment was sufficient authorization for anything. He thought about how that happened, how it might have happened, because Harry had spent 3 months learning to think about the shape of things rather than just their surface. He thought, you save the world once, and then twice, and then you start to believe that your assessment of what saving the world requires is itself infallible, and by the time you're stealing from a child's estate you've been operating as the sole authority on what's necessary for so long that the concept of oversight has become theoretical. He didn't forgive it. He'd said that to Hermione and meant it. But he understood the shape of it, which was different from forgiveness and more useful, because you couldn't navigate something you didn't understand. He fell asleep at 3:30 with that thought still running, and when he woke at 6 and got dressed in his best robes and took the Potter and Peverell rings from the holding chain and put them on his hands, he felt clear. Clear the way a day is clear after the weather has decided what it's going to be. The Wisengamot chamber was fuller than the emergency session had been. The emergency session had the quality of something called quickly, the audience still adjusting to its own presence. The trial had the quality of something prepared for, Every seat in the public gallery was occupied, the Wisengamot members were all present, the press pool had been allowed in at the far end behind a rope barrier that Madame Bones's aurors were maintaining with considerable determination. Harry saw a quill moving in the press section and noted the witch holding it was writing fast enough that the quill was generating small heat sparks. McGonagall walked with him to the inner ring. She sat in the chair designated for his counsel, beside his seat, and was wearing her Hogwarts robes with all the formal weight she could give them. Augusta Longbottom was already seated in the public gallery, upright and fierce in a hat with a stuffed vulture on it that was somehow perfectly suited to the occasion. Neville, beside her, caught Harry's eye and nodded. Hermione was in the gallery too, in the second row, with 3 books on her lap and a quill behind her ear. Lady Greengrass was on the inner ring, her face composed and watchful. Director Bones entered from the side door, crisp and official in DMLE robes, 2 aurors behind her with the sealed evidence boxes. She gave Harry a brief nod, the nod of a professional acknowledging a colleague, which Harry felt the specific weight of and appreciated accordingly. Ragnarok was present. That was the room-stopping detail. Ragnarok of Gringotts, who had not attended a ministry function in 43 years, sat in a specially arranged seat at the floor level beside the evidence table, dressed in formal goblin attire that was dark and precise and bristling with the quiet authority of independent jurisdiction. Several Wisengamot members were visibly unsettled by his presence, which told Harry a great deal about which members had been counting on Gringotts' participation remaining theoretical. Marchbanks entered last, took the chair, and called the session to order with the single bang of her gavel that always meant she expected to use it only once. Dumbledore entered from the door that was used for the accused. He came in without guards. He hadn't been arrested, the Wisengamot was not a criminal court in the conventional sense, and the charges were civil criminal, which meant he walked in under his own authority as a citizen and former officer of the body. He wore his robes, though not the chief warlock's chain, which had been formally stripped when his privileges were suspended. He walked to the chair at the center of the floor, the chair that in criminal trials had chains, which in this proceeding remained retracted, and sat down with the bearing of a man who has decided that dignity is the last fortress and intends to hold it. He looked at Harry once. Harry looked back. Then Marchbanks said, "Let's begin," and the trial of Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore commenced. Bones opened. She was magnificent. Harry had seen her work in meetings, had seen the precision of her mind in correspondence, but watching her in the chamber was different, watching her lay the case out with the structural confidence of someone who has spent months making sure every brick is load-bearing before placing the next one. She began with the guardianship record. The will. She produced the ministry's copy, the will of James and Lily Potter, dated October 1981, and the notable absence of Albus Dumbledore from its provisions. The will named Sirius Black as primary guardian and Frank and Alice Longbottom as secondary. It did not name Dumbledore. It did not grant him power of attorney. It did not authorize him to manage the estate. She let that sit for a moment. Then she produced the instrument that had been used to establish Dumbledore's guardianship authority over the accounts, a piece of parchment bearing the signatures of 2 ministry officials, countersigned with what purported to be a magical verification from Gringotts. "This instrument," she said, "is a forgery. The Gringotts verification signature is not authentic. Chief Ragnarok will testify to that directly." She turned to Ragnarok. "Chief Ragnarok." Ragnarok stood. He did not move to a witness position, he simply stood where he was and spoke, because Gringotts' judicial independence meant he wasn't subject to the Wisengamot's positional protocols, and everyone present either knew that or was finding out now. "The verification signature on that instrument," Ragnarok said, in a voice that had the specific weight of a being who has been verifying things for 500 years, "was created using a replication charm applied to a genuine Gringotts verification seal from a 1979 account document. We have the original document. We have analyzed the magical trace. The replication was performed by hand, with precision, by someone with intimate knowledge of how our verification seals are applied." He looked at Dumbledore. "There are 7 wizards alive who have sufficient access to authentic Gringotts instruments to perform this replication. Albus Dumbledore is one of them. The chamber took that in. We are not, Ragnarok continued, accusing him of the forgery on the basis of possibility alone. We are accusing him on the basis of magical trace analysis that identifies specific enchanting patterns consistent with his documented spellwork, on file with Gringotts from 11 separate authenticated instruments he has signed since 1965. A pause. The pattern is distinctive. It is his. Chief Ragnarok, Marchbank said. Is Gringotts filing its own formal charges? Gringotts is filing a formal notice of account violation, fraud, and unauthorized access, Ragnarok said. To be resolved under Goblin jurisdiction concurrent with this proceeding. The penalty under Goblin law for the fraudulent use of a Gringotts verification seal is, he paused, and something moved in his expression that was not quite a smile but was in the vicinity, significant. He sat. Bones proceeded to the withdrawals. She had the full certified audit, walked through it line by line, and she was unsparing. The order operational fund. The personal account transfers. The quarterly disbursements. The shell account that had received the property transfers, which Lucius Malfoy had documented and which bore, at the registration level, a set of initials that were not hard to decode. When she finished the financial section and moved to the trust committee, Augusta Longbottom was allowed to speak from the public gallery, which Marchbanks permitted under the existing party's provision. Augusta spoke for 5 minutes. She spoke about Frank and Alice. She spoke about the Longbottom estate and the 20% administrative fees and 10 years of being told the losses were due to the war. She spoke without theatrics and with the iron composure of a woman who has been grieving for a decade and has found something useful to do with it. When she finished, the chamber was silent in the way it gets when something has genuinely landed. The defense may now present, Marchbanks said. Dumbledore stood. He was, Harry thought, the best argument for his own defense. He stood in the center of that floor and he was everything he'd always been, brilliant, warm, sorrowful in exactly the right register, the weight of the world carried with the practiced grace of someone who has been carrying it for so long that the carrying itself has become a kind of authority. He acknowledged the withdrawals. He had, he said, always intended to acknowledge them. The emergency session had simply accelerated a conversation he had been planning to initiate when Harry was older and could better understand the context. He spoke about the war. He spoke about it not as an excuse but as architecture, the structure of necessity within which choices had been made, choices that he would not unmake even now, because the world those choices had helped preserve was the world in which they were all currently standing. He spoke about Harry. He spoke about the boy, the prophecy, the specific and terrible weight of knowing what was coming for that child and trying to calibrate a life for him that would leave him capable of surviving it. He said that the management of the estate had been, in his judgment, preferable to a childhood in which Harry Potter knew himself to be the heir of 19 ancient houses and the target of a returning Dark Lord. He said, I was trying to keep him safe. It was not a weak argument. It landed differently on different people in the room. Harry could see that, the outer ring shifting, some members clearly moved by it, the decades of trust and loyalty weighing against the documented numbers. Then Marchbanks said, Lord Potter Peverell. Response. Harry stood. He had thought about this, the response to I was trying to keep him safe. He had thought about it a lot, because it was the argument that required the most from him, not legally, but personally. The legal case was airtight. It was the personal case that needed handling. I believe him, Harry said. The chamber went slightly uncertain. Even Dumbledore's expression shifted. I believe that's what he thought he was doing, Harry said. I think he genuinely believed that a boy who didn't know his own power was safer than one who did. I think he looked at what happened to the last person Voldemort came after and decided that less was more, less wealth, less identity, less knowledge of what he actually was. He paused. I also think he was completely wrong. He looked at Dumbledore directly. You took 2 million galleons from my family's vaults, he said. You forged the instrument that gave you access. You managed those accounts for a decade without filing a single legally required annual accounting. You placed my godfather in Azkaban without a trial, and will come to that. You put me in a cupboard. He let that last sentence be simple. He didn't raise his voice. Not literally, he continued. You put me with the Dursleys. You chose them, presumably knowing their attitude toward magic, and you left me there. For 10 years. And you knew the entire time, that there were 7 vaults with my name on them, that I held 19 lordships, that there was a seat on this body waiting for me, that my parents had chosen a different guardian who was rotting in Azkaban. And you decided that all of that was less important than your assessment of what a boy needed to be in order to be useful to you when the time came. The chamber was utterly still. I don't need you to have been a villain, Harry said. You don't need to have twirled a cape or wanted to do harm. What you did is worse than that, in a way. What you did was decide that your judgment superseded the law, superseded my parents' will, superseded the rights of every family whose accounts your committee touched, and you did it all with the absolute certainty of a man who has been right so many times that the idea of being wrong has stopped feeling possible. He paused. That's not evil. That's something scarier. That's a person who has become so convinced of the rightness of his own reasoning that oversight looks like an obstacle. He sat down. The chamber breathed. Marchbanks looked at Dumbledore. Is there a response? Dumbledore was quiet for a long moment. He was looking at Harry with an expression that had shed its layers, the warmth and the sorrow and the performed authority. There was something underneath all of that was older and starker, and Harry thought it might be the closest thing to honest that the man had available. No, Dumbledore said quietly. There is not. Bones then did the thing she had told Harry was coming, the thing she had prepared in her separate inquiry and saved for this moment. She called for the official Wizengamot record of Sirius Black's sentencing to be entered into evidence. It was 4 pages. The Wizengamot clerk placed them on the evidence table. Marchbanks reviewed them. There is no trial record, Marchbanks said. Her voice was very flat. There is no trial record, Bones confirmed. Sirius Black was sentenced to Azkaban on November 3, 1981, under emergency ministerial powers signed by Bartemius Crouch Sr. He was never tried before the Wizengamot. He was never given the opportunity to present a defense. He has been imprisoned for 12 years on the basis of an emergency instrument that has been ruled in subsequent legal opinions to have required full Wizengamot ratification within 60 days, ratification that was never sought and never given. She produced a second document. Additionally, my inquiry has identified a witness. Peter Pettigrew, reported killed by Sirius Black on November 3, 1981, in the street where the alleged crime occurred, the death for which Black has been imprisoned. We have been unable to find a body. She paused. We have been unable to find a record of any body. We have a wand. We have rubble. We have 12 Muggle deaths from what appears to be a different magical signature than Sirius Black's documented spellwork. We have no body. The chamber erupted. It took Marchbanks 3 bangs to restore order. No body, she repeated, when the noise had collapsed. 12 years in Azkaban for a crime for which there is no confirmed victim, no trial, no ratified emergency instrument, and a forensic magical trace that does not match the accused. She looked at the Wizengamot. I am formally requesting the immediate establishment of a review tribunal for Sirius Black, with a view to, at minimum, granting him the trial he was denied in 1981. So moved, said Lady Greengrass, from the inner ring. Seconded, said the old wizard in the corner, who Harry had since learned was Lord Tiberius Ogden, 91 years old, the longest-serving member of the Wizengamot and someone who took procedural violations with a personal intensity. Motion carries, Marchbanks said, without calling for a count, because the room was clearly with it and she had no patience for theatre when substance was available. Harry sat very still through all of this. He had known it was coming, Bones had told him the outline, prepared him, but there was a difference between knowing a thing was going to happen and being present while it happened, and the difference lived in the chest, in the specific place where you keep things that matter beyond their practical significance. 12 years. His godfather had been in that place for 12 years. He would deal with that feeling later. He would take it out and look at it properly later, when the chamber was empty and the verdict was in and the work was done. For now he kept it folded up, handled carefully, in the interior pocket that he'd been developing all his life for things too large to hold in the open. Marchbanks called for the Wisingamot to deliberate on the charges against Dumbledore. This was the formal stage, the structured voting procedure, each charge addressed separately, the body as a whole determining the finding on each count. It took 40 minutes. Financial misappropriation of a minor's estate, guilty, passed 73 to 14. Forgery of Gringotts authorization instruments, guilty, passed 68 to 19. Failure to file legally required annual estate accountings, guilty, passed 81 to 6. Even most of Dumbledore's allies couldn't argue against a legal requirement that was in writing. Abuse of guardianship authority, guilty, passed 66 to 21. The Trust Committee charges, which applied to the broader structure rather than Dumbledore alone, were sent to a separate subcommittee to investigate each individual member, which was the procedurally correct approach and which Marchbanks noted would be conducted under DMLE oversight with findings reported within 60 days. When the last vote was called, Marchbanks set down her gavel and looked at Dumbledore. The sentence, she said, on the findings of this body, is as follows. Restitution of all documented withdrawals from the Potter and associated family accounts, with interest calculated at the Gringotts standard rate for the relevant period. Restitution of equivalent amounts to all other families affected by the Trust Committee, pending the subcommittee's findings. Formal revocation of Chief Warlock privileges permanently. Formal revocation of position as Supreme Mugwump of the International Confederation of Wizards, to be communicated to that body directly. And a period of 12 months supervised restriction of magical activity, the terms of which will be determined by the DMLE and overseen by Director Bones. She paused. Imprisonment was considered, she said. The motion was raised and debated. The body determined, by a vote of 52 to 35, that the combination of restitution, revocation of authority, and supervised restriction reflects the full measure of consequence without the complications of imprisoning a wizard of Albus Dumbledore's power and standing at this particular moment in our history. She looked at Harry. Lord Potter Peverell, do you find this sentence acceptable? Harry stood. He thought about Hermione's question, do you actually want him imprisoned? He thought about what he'd said in return. Yes, he said. On one condition. That the position of Chief Warlock is not simply vacated, but that the powers associated with it are formally reviewed and the concentration of authority it represents is examined by a constitutional committee. Because the problem here is not only Albus Dumbledore. The problem is a set of structures that allowed one person to hold enough authority that oversight became effectively impossible. He looked at Marchbanks. I'd like to help with that committee. If that's acceptable. The pause that followed was the kind of pause that happens when a room adjusts to something it wasn't expecting, even though in retrospect it should have been. Marchbanks, for the first time in the proceedings, smiled. It was a small smile, brief, the smile of someone at the very end of a very long career watching something they thought might not happen in their lifetime actually happen. Acceptable, she said. She looked at Dumbledore one final time. Dumbledore had been sitting through the sentencing with the composed stillness of a man absorbing something final. Now he looked up and met Marchbanks's eyes, and then looked at Harry, and what was on his face was not rage or contempt or even the dignified sorrow he'd performed earlier. It was something simpler than that. Something that looked, with some effort to name it, like recognition, the specific recognition of a man who has finally been shown the thing he couldn't see himself, and who is old enough and honest enough to know it. He said nothing. There was nothing to say that wouldn't make it worse. He stood, because sitting was no longer available to him in this room or in this role, and he walked to the door through which he'd come, and he left. The chamber released a breath it had been holding for 40 minutes. Afterward, in the corridor outside the chamber, Harry stood against the wall and let the noise of departing Wisingamot members flow around him. He was looking at his hands, the Potter ring, the Peverell ring, warm against his fingers the way they always were now, the warmth he'd gotten used to and relied on in the way you rely on a hand at your back. McGonagall appeared beside him. She didn't say anything immediately. They stood together in the corridor and listened to the sound of a world reassembling itself around a new configuration, which was a physical sound as much as anything, footsteps and voices recalibrating, the texture of institutional air when something that has been fixed for a long time has just moved. "How do you feel?" she asked finally. Harry thought about it. "Strange," he said. "Not bad. Just, strange. Like standing in a room after the furniture's been moved. The room's the same but you keep reaching for things in the wrong place." She nodded. "He's going to be all right," Harry said. "Dumbledore. In the long run. He's not going to prison, he's not being destroyed. He's just, smaller now. More proportionate. He'll find that very difficult," McGonagall said. "Probably." Harry paused. "He might even do some good with it. People sometimes do, when they have to work within limits for the first time." McGonagall was quiet for a moment. "You're quite something, you know," she said. "For 11. Almost 12, Harry said. "Almost 12, she agreed. Hermione found him a minute later, weaving through the thinning crowd with her books clutched to her chest and her expression doing the thing it did when she was processing multiple things simultaneously and needed to discharge some of them or she'd short-circuit. "The Constitutional Committee," she said. "You brought that up unprepared." "It wasn't unprepared," he said. "I just hadn't mentioned it beforehand. There's a difference. I knew the case would produce a verdict. I knew the sentence options. The Constitutional Committee was the next logical step from both of them." He started walking toward the lifts. "Do you want to help with it?" She fell into step beside him. "Obviously." "Good. Because the review of Chief Warlock powers is going to require the kind of historical research that I can do but that you can do faster and better." "I've already started," she said. "I've been reading about the original constitution of the office since October. There are some genuinely alarming precedents that have simply never been tested because the previous Chief Warlocks didn't push into the borderline territory that, tell me at dinner," he said. "Write up what you found. We'll work through it over the holidays. I'm going home for Christmas." "So am I," he said. He paused. He wasn't going to Privet Drive. McGonagall had already arranged, with his full enthusiasm, that he would spend Christmas at Hogwarts, where the castle would be mostly empty and the library entirely available and the quiet would be the productive kind. "After the holidays, then." She nodded. Then, more quietly, Sirius Black. "I know. The review tribunal," Bones said within the month, "if the evidence holds." "I know," he said again. He kept his voice steady and informative. "It'll hold. The evidence holds. We'll see him soon." She looked at him. She was smart enough not to push past the steadiness, because she'd worked out over the last months that steadiness in Harry was not the same as absence, it was presence, deliberate and chosen, the choice to hold something rather than be held by it. She respected it. "All right," she said. Neville was waiting near the lift with Augusta, who looked at Harry with the expression of someone who has witnessed justice and finds it, against expectation, slightly strange to see in person. She gripped his arm when he reached them, briefly, firmly, not a hug but more than a handshake, the particular physical language of a woman who expresses things through grips. "Well done," she said. "Neville helped," Harry said. Augusta looked at her grandson. Neville was standing straight, his notebook under his arm, Trevor the Toad visible as a small lump in his breast pocket, and he had the quality of someone who had arrived somewhere they weren't sure they could reach and had just looked back at the distance covered. "He did," Augusta said, and it was the warmest Harry had heard her voice in any of their meetings. They took the lift up together, the five of them, Harry, McGonagall, Hermione, Neville, Augusta, and the doors closed and the ministry slid downward around them, and somewhere in the chamber below Marchbanks was closing proceedings, and somewhere above them London was going on with its business in the enormous ordinary way that cities go on with business regardless of what is happening beneath them. Harry leaned against the back wall of the lift and thought about Vault 7. After Christmas, he'd decided. He'd go after Christmas, when term started again and the dust from the trial had settled and the world had organized itself around the new configuration. He'd take the key and go to the innermost vault and find out what his father had left waiting for him. The lift arrived at the atrium. The golden fountain stood in its center, and Harry looked at it, and thought about what he'd said in the chamber about structures and oversight and the people who were supposed to be protected by them. He'd meant it about the fountain too. Not urgently. Not today. But in the fullness of time, when he had the standing and the opportunity. Something more honest. The doors opened. They walked out into the morning. It was cold, the specific December cold that presages snow, and the street above the telephone box entrance was grey and sharp and real. McGonagall held the port key, the same clay pot she'd been using for months, and Harry reached for it, and before he did he looked up at the sky above the London street, just for a moment, just long enough to remember that there was sky, that there had always been sky, that the ceiling of the world was a great deal higher than anyone had let him believe for the first 11 years of his life. Then he took the port key and the world folded him home. Chapter 6, Lord of Houses, son of James. The Christmas holidays arrived with the first real snow, heavy, serious snow that settled on the castle's towers and the grounds and the frozen surface of the Black Lake with the permanence of something that had made up its mind. Most of Hogwarts emptied into the Hogwarts Express and then into families and homes and warm ordinary Christmases, and the castle contracted to its winter self, quieter, deeper, the portraits more conversational and the corridors more personal, the stone itself seeming to breathe differently when it wasn't performing school. Harry stayed. Ron had looked uncertain about leaving him, which Harry had appreciated and waved off with genuine warmth. The Weasleys had enough people already, and Harry had things to do that required the particular quality of quiet that only a mostly empty castle in December could provide. He spent Christmas Eve in the library. Not frantically, he wasn't racing anything tonight. He sat by the window that looked out over the snow-covered grounds and read Ragnar's Goblin Metallurgy book from cover to cover, which turned out to be less about metallurgy and more about the philosophy of inherited objects, the idea that magical items don't just carry power but carry intention, the deliberate will of the person who made or owned them impressed into the material itself. He read about the holding chain he'd been given for the Lordship rings and understood for the first time that it wasn't just a storage solution, it was a relational object, each ring in dialogue with the others, the full sum of the 19 houses not just added together but woven, each bloodline reinforcing the others in ways that became visible only when the whole was assembled. He went to bed and slept well, which was something he'd gotten better at over the past few months, the sleep of someone who is busy enough and purposeful enough that the body simply insists. On Christmas morning there were presents. More than he'd ever had in his life, which was not, admittedly, a very high bar, but the fact of them still did something to his chest that he didn't try to analyze too deeply. From Ron, a packet of chocolate frogs and a very Ronish note that said "Hope your Christmas is good, mate, Mom says you're invited for New Year if McGonagall says yes." From Hermione, a book titled The Wizard's Procedural, a complete guide to Wisengamot practice and constitutional law, annotated in the margins with her own notes in extremely small writing, which meant she'd read it and considered it worth giving, which was the highest compliment available. From Neville, a small pot of herbological salve that his grandmother apparently pressed on everyone she liked, and a note that said his review tribunal for the Longbottom accounts was scheduled for January, and that Gran sent her best. From Fred and George, a map they'd been working on, hand-drawn and enchanted, of every secret passage in Hogwarts they'd discovered over 4 years of dedicated exploration. It was detailed enough to be genuinely useful and illegal enough to be genuinely delightful. From McGonagall, a note saying that New Year's at the Burrow was approved, delivered with the warmth of someone who had been trying to quietly give him the Christmas they thought he deserved without making it something he felt he needed to be grateful for. From Lady Greengrass, a formal letter confirming his seat on the Constitutional Committee, with a list of other members and a suggested agenda. She had added, at the bottom in a different ink, Your mother used to say that the only thing worse than broken institutions is people who have stopped believing they can be fixed. I thought you'd want to know that. He read that one twice and folded it very carefully. And then, underneath all of it, wrapped in plain cloth that had no smell and no magical signature that he could detect, was a letter. Not in an envelope. Just a letter, folded once, with his name on the outside in handwriting he didn't recognize, a big, looping, confident hand that had the quality of someone who wrote fast because they were always thinking faster than they could get the words down. He opened it. Harry, if you're reading this, the vault opened for you, which means you've claimed the Lordships, which means you're ready. I left this in the holding charm with the rings. Figured they'd find their way to you when the time was right. Magic has its own ideas about timing and I've learned not to argue with it. I don't know how old you are when you're reading this. I wrote it in October 1981, which gives you some context. Your mum's in the kitchen and you're asleep upstairs, making the specific noise babies make when they're very pleased with themselves for no reason, which is a noise that I will apparently think about for the rest of my life. I'm not going to tell you everything in a letter. The vault will do that. There are journals, 12 of them, and Sirius knows about those, so if he's with you he'll be able to fill in whatever the journals miss. If he's not with you, find him. He's either doing something heroic or something idiotic, and either way he needs to be found. What I will tell you is this, the Potter Lordship is real and it is yours, and don't let anyone tell you to be small about it. Your mother's family had magic going back to the old world and it flows through you, and that is yours too. The 19 houses, by the time you're reading this you'll have found out about them, and I want you to know I found out when I was 22 and it took me a full week to stop walking into walls. I imagine you handled it better. The accounts, if the accounts are gone, I'm sorry. I couldn't find a way to lock them that someone sufficiently clever couldn't get around, and whoever I was worried about was sufficiently clever. I just want you to know it wasn't nothing. It was your grandmother's 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 galleons, stretching back to before the statute of secrecy, and it was real and it belonged to you, and whatever happened to it is not your fault and never was. Voldemort is not gone. I think you know that. He's going to come back eventually, and when he does you're going to have to deal with it, and I'm sorry about that, I'm so sorry. It is the one thing about this situation that I cannot make peace with, that you will have to carry something that should never have been a child's to carry. The only thing I can tell you is that it won't break you. I know that without knowing you. I know it because of who your mother is, because of who her magic is, and because of the way you look at things. Even now, even at 15 months old, you look at things like you're deciding what you think about them, not like you're waiting to be told. Trust that. It's the best thing about you, and I knew it before you could talk. There's a room in Vault 7 with everything I couldn't keep safe above ground. Take what's useful. Leave what isn't. The invisibility cloak, that should have found you already. I left it to Dumbledore as a loan, not a gift, so if he hasn't returned it yet, take it back directly, it's yours. Lastly, I would have been better. Given time. I was not the best version of myself in the years before you. I was too angry and too certain and too willing to dismiss people who thought differently. Your mother made me better, is the honest answer, and Sirius made me worse in the specific ways that were entertaining but not always good, and Remus made me think more carefully, and Peter, we won't talk about Peter in a letter, you'll have the journals. I would have been better for you. I need you to know that. Not because it matters to the practical situation, but because I was your father and I would have chosen you every time, no contest, and I want that on record. I love you, Harry. I loved you from the moment you existed. I'll love you in whatever comes after this, which your mother says is a certainty, and I've decided to believe her because she's right about most things. Be good. Be fair. And when it comes to it, hit first. Dad. Harry sat with the letter in his hands for a long time. He was in the window seat of the library, the snow still falling outside, the castle very quiet around him, and he sat there for probably 20 minutes without moving, just holding the letter and letting it be what it was. Then he folded it along its original crease, carefully, and put it in the interior breast pocket of his robes, directly over his sternum, and thought, all right. He went to breakfast. The day after Christmas he went to Gringotts. McGonagall came with him, same as before. They flew to Diagon Alley in the morning, the street quiet and post-Christmas, a few shops open, the cold air carrying the smell of frost and chimney smoke. Griphook met them at the door. Not with ceremony, with efficiency, the directness of goblins that Harry had come to appreciate fully, the absence of any need to manage his feelings about what was happening. Vault 7 was at the deepest level. The cart ride was long and steep, the darkness total except for the torches Griphook carried, and Harry felt the castle receding above him as they descended, felt the weight of the mountain, the great old stone of it, and underneath that something else, something that pulsed faintly like a kept promise. The vault door was different from the others. No keyhole. Just smooth dark metal with a shallow impression in the center, shaped like a hand. Griphook stepped back. "Only a potter," he said. Harry pressed his right hand to the impression. The metal was warm. Warmer than the rings, even, a warmth that moved up his arm and through his chest and settled somewhere behind his eyes, and he thought, "I know this. This is my father's magic." This is what he felt like. The door opened. Inside was a room, not a vault, a proper room, lit by magical torches that had been burning for 12 years waiting for this moment, with a stone floor and shelves along 3 walls and a table in the center. The shelves held 12 journals, dark green leather, a small stack of photographs, 3 spell books with notes written in their margins, a sealed document box marked Lily's research, a mirror that showed not Harry's reflection but a view of a garden he didn't recognize, and on the table, a single object under a glass dome, a small golden instrument that he couldn't identify but that rotated slowly in the still air of the room, its mechanism as precise and purposeful as a heartbeat. He crossed to the journals first. He took all 12. He put them in the bag he brought without opening any of them, because this was not the place and the moment to read his father's private thoughts, that required a fire and an evening and the right kind of quiet. He took the photographs and the spell books. He took Lily's research box, which was sealed with a charm he couldn't break on the spot but that Hermione would probably have open in 4 minutes. He picked up the golden instrument carefully and examined it. It had a base of twisted metal and 4 arms that moved independently, each one tracking something he couldn't identify, and it gave off a faint warmth that was different from the vault warmth, more urgent, more present. "What is this?" he asked Griphook. Griphook looked at it. "A Horcrux detector," he said. "Built by your father with specifications derived from your mother's research. It tracks the magical signature of a soul fragment artificially detached from its owner." A pause. "Your mother believed the Dark Lord had created them. Your father built the instrument to confirm it." Harry looked at the instrument. At its 4 moving arms. "Does it work?" he said. "It is functioning now," Griphook said. "Whether it works," he paused, and looked at Harry with amber eyes that were very direct, "you would need to be in the presence of a Horcrux to test it." Harry thought about the 3rd-floor corridor. About the door with the warmth behind it. About the thing he'd walked away from on Christmas Eve because he had enough to manage. He put the instrument in his bag. "Thank you," he said to the vault, which was not a sensible thing to say but felt right, and the torches flickered once in the way that old magic acknowledges the thing said to it. They rode the cart back up in silence. Harry sat with the bag on his lap and thought about his mother's research and his father's instrument and a Dark Lord who wasn't gone, who had never been gone, who was somewhere in the castle right now unless Harry was wrong about the warmth behind the door. He didn't think he was wrong. McGonagall was waiting in the entrance hall. She took one look at his face and said, "What did you find?" "Evidence," he said. "And something that needs dealing with sooner rather than later." She looked at the bag. "How soon?" "Before term starts," he said. "Possibly before New Year." She was quiet for a moment. "Then, tell me." He told her. He spent 2 days at the Burrow. Not because he had to, he could have stayed at Hogwarts and continued working, and there was a voice in him that wanted to, the voice that had developed over a childhood of not stopping, not pausing, not allowing things to simply be. But the Weasley household at New Year was the specific antidote to that voice. It was loud and warm and full of people who cared about each other in the unceremonious way of families that are too busy living together to make performances of it. Mrs. Weasley fed him with the focused energy of someone who has identified a problem and is resolving it through pastry. Mr. Weasley asked him 14 questions about Muggle objects with genuine delight. The twins were engaged in a project in their room that produced occasional banging sounds and once a small controlled explosion that Fred described as a developmental step. Ginny, who he hadn't properly met before, Ron's youngest and only sister, observed him from a careful distance for 2 hours and then, apparently having completed her assessment, sat down across from him at the dinner table and informed him that his handling of the Wisengamot session had been quite good, but there were 3 procedural improvements that would have tightened it. She was 10. She'd clearly read the full trial record. Harry looked at Ron. Ron made the face of a brother who has given up being surprised. She's been like that since she could read, Ron said. Fair warning. It was good advice, Harry said. Ginny went slightly pink and looked at her plate, which was the only moment in the entire visit when she looked like a 10-year-old rather than a small version of someone much older. Ron, on New Year's Eve, asked quietly while they were sitting on the garden wall in the cold, "Are you actually all right?" Not the official version. Actually. Harry thought about it. "I found a letter from my dad," he said. "In the vault." Ron was quiet. "He wrote it the month before he died," Harry said. "He said he'd have been better if he'd had more time." He looked at the dark garden, the frost on the grass. "I don't know what to do with that. You'd think it would be sad, and it is, a bit, but it's more than I had before. Which is something." Ron sat with that for a moment. "My dad wrote us letters when he thought Voldemort might come back when, before you started school. Just in case letters. We found them in his desk." He paused. "We didn't tell him we found them. It felt like it would make him sad to know we'd needed to read them." Harry looked at him. "But I'm glad we did," Ron said. "Because it told us what he thought was important." "Which was us." "That was the whole letter, really. Just, you're what matters." He shrugged, a bit awkward with the weight of it. "I think your dad's letter probably said the same thing." "It did," Harry said. "Yeah." They sat on the wall in the cold and watched the frost and the sky, and it was comfortable in the way that being with someone who understands without requiring explanation is comfortable, and Harry thought that this, too, was something he hadn't known to want and had been given anyway. The third-floor corridor on the 4th of January, 9 o'clock in the evening. Harry had the Horcrux detector in his hand. It had been pointing, insistently, with a kind of urgency that he'd been tracking since he brought it back from Gringotts, toward the castle's 3rd floor for 4 days. He'd confirmed it with Hermione, who had opened Lily's research box in 3 minutes and 50 seconds and spent the subsequent 48 hours reading everything inside with an expression of progressive, escalating alarm. Your mother was brilliant, she'd told him, which he'd known, but hearing it in Hermione's voice was its own specific confirmation. The theoretical framework for Horcrux detection is, she built this from first principles, Harry. There was nothing like it before. I know. And if the instrument is pointing toward the 3rd floor, there's something up there, he said. Voldemort's not gone, she said. It wasn't a question. She'd been working toward that conclusion for 2 days. No. Is he in the castle? Harry thought about Quirrell. About the stutter that disappeared on certain words. About the turban. About the way he'd stood over Harry's work in defense, reading it with the quality of someone who wanted something. I think he's attached to someone, he said. I think that's how he survived. Not alive, not dead, but attached. Leeching. Looking for a path back. She was very quiet. Quirrell, she said finally. That's my guess. What are you going to do? He'd thought about this carefully, the way he thought about everything now, not impulsively, not waiting either, just, clearly, with full information and honest assessment. Tonight, he said. I'm going to find out what's behind the door. She started to say something. Not alone, he said. McGonagall knows. She'll be watching the corridor. But I need to go in, because the instrument only responds to blood heirs of a confirmed most ancient house and I'm the only one currently available. Hermione looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, I'm coming to the corridor. I'm not going through the door, because I understand why I can't help in there. But I'm in the corridor. He looked at her. Don't argue with me, she said. It's not a hill I'll retreat from. He didn't argue. So, 9 o'clock. Third floor corridor. The detector warm in his hand, pointing ahead with the certainty of something that knows exactly what it's looking for. Hermione behind him, 3 steps back, her own wand out. McGonagall visible at the far end of the corridor, stationed there with the particular still authority of someone who has positioned themselves between a child and a danger and intends to remain between them regardless of outcome. The door. Harry put his hand on the handle. It opened without resistance, which was not what he'd expected. He'd expected enchantments, resistance, the locked door difficulty of something being actively protected. Instead it opened easily, as if it had been waiting, as if it were glad. Inside was a large room. Large enough that the door didn't obviously connect to the castle's external dimensions, a space that was slightly more than it appeared from outside. In the center of the room, on a wooden platform, sat a large mirror in an ornate frame, the words Eris stra eru oit ube kafru oit on wosi carved along the top. And in front of the mirror, with his back to Harry, was Quirrell. He was standing very still. He'd been standing there for a while, Harry thought. There was a quality to his stillness that was less the stillness of someone who had just arrived and more the stillness of someone who had been there long enough that the stillness had become its own kind of problem. I know you're here, Quirrell said. The stutter was entirely absent. I wondered when you'd come. Harry crossed the room and stood 10 feet behind him. The detector was pulling strongly to the left, toward Quirrell, toward the back of his head, toward the turban. What are you looking for in the mirror? Harry said. What everyone looks for, Quirrell said. What I was sent to find. He still hadn't turned. Can you see it? In the mirror? Harry looked at the mirror. He saw himself, 11 years old, in his school robes, the rings on his hands, the detector in his right, and beside him, barely visible, 2 figures. A woman with red hair and a man with glasses and dark hair that was a mess, and both of them were looking at him with expressions that he had no name for, something between pride and love and the specific tenderness of people who know they have very little time. He looked at them for 1 full second. He allowed that. Then he looked away. I see what I want, he said. But I'm not going to try to take it from the mirror, which is the trap, isn't it? Quirrell turned. His face was the face Harry knew, pale, twitchy, the eyes behind the expression that was always slightly off, slightly not him, slightly the face of a man who has been sharing his skull with something that doesn't fit. You're not afraid, Quirrell said, and he sounded genuinely puzzled by it. Should I be? Most would be. Most haven't spent 3 months learning what they're actually capable of, Harry said. Professor. Are you in there? Underneath it. Are you still in there? Something moved across Quirrell's face, something that was Quirrell, briefly, the pleasant ordinary man who had taught Muggle studies before the year away, the man Percy had described as not nervous before. It surfaced like something coming up from deep water and was immediately suppressed. Not enough of me, Quirrell said, and that was Quirrell's voice, Quirrell's cadence, and it was afraid. Not of Harry. Of what was behind it. Not enough anymore. Then step back, Harry said. Step back as far as you can. Right now. Whatever part of you is still you, push back. Quirrell's body went rigid. The struggle was visible, a physical thing, his hands clenching, his expression cycling between himself and something older and colder and infinitely more dangerous. And then the turban moved. Harry didn't step back. He widened his stance and kept the detector in his right hand and his wand in his left, and he looked at what was beneath the turban, the face at the back of Quirrell's head, the face that was not a face, the face of something that had survived a decade by refusing to die correctly, and he said, very clearly, "Hello." The face on the back of Quirrell's head opened its eyes. They were red. The room temperature dropped 10 degrees in about 4 seconds. "Harry Potter," said the voice, and it was not Quirrell's voice, it was something that had once been a voice and was now more like a frequency, the register of something that didn't need breath and was using it anyway as a courtesy or a threat. "You've been busy." "Yes," Harry said. 19 lordships, the voice said. It was, Harry thought, almost amused. "Almost. Your father managed one. Your mother's family had none at all. You've done considerable work for 11 years old." "Almost 12, Harry said. "Indeed." A pause. The red eyes were evaluating him in the way that only things that are genuinely ancient can evaluate, not the calculation of politicians or strategists but the assessment of something that has watched centuries of witches and wizards be born and act and die and has developed opinions about what any given human being is likely to do when pressed. "You're not here to destroy me." "I might be," Harry said. "No. You're here to understand the situation. You're here because your mother's instrument told you I was here and you needed to know what that meant." The voice was very flat. "You're here because you don't act without information and you wanted the information." "Also," Harry said, "I wanted you to know that I know." A silence. "You wanted me to know," the voice repeated. "You've been in this castle since September operating on the assumption that I was the boy from Privet Drive," Harry said. "Small, uninformed, manageable. I wanted to clarify that I'm not any of those things, and that what you're looking for in this castle, whatever it is, whatever Quirrell was searching for, you're not going to find it with me unaware. And if I tell you what I'm looking for, I'll already know before you tell me," Harry said. "My mother's research was thorough. The Philosopher's Stone. He knew it was in the castle. Hagrid had mentioned retrieving something from Gringotts Vault 713 on Harry's birthday, and Hermione had identified the stone from Nicholas Flamel's name in the library. He'd been putting the pieces together since November. The voice was quiet for a long moment. The red eyes didn't blink, things that didn't have proper bodies didn't need to blink, apparently. When it spoke again something had shifted in it, some quality of the power performance had been set aside, and what remained was stranger and more honest. "You're not afraid of me," it said. Not the puzzled observation Quirrell had made, this was different. This was the voice of something trying to recalibrate. "You killed my parents," Harry said. "I've thought about you a lot. Fear stopped being the primary response a while ago. What replaced it?" Harry thought about it honestly, because the question deserved honesty even from this source. "Purpose," he said. "You're a problem that needs solving. I'm going to solve it. That's not bravery, it's just clarity." Another long silence. The room was very cold. Somewhere behind Harry, outside the open door, he could hear Hermione breathing, steady, deliberately steady, the breath of someone working to stay calm. "Your mother was the same," the voice said, and it was the quietest it had been, the most strict. "She looked at me and she didn't see a monster. She saw a problem with a cause and a solution. That was why it was so difficult." A pause. "And then she chose to die for you, and the choice, it left a mark on you that I cannot touch. I have been looking at that mark since September, trying to find a way around it." "There isn't one," Harry said. "No," the voice agreed. "There isn't." And then, with something that was the barest whisper of something it probably hadn't felt in decades, "She was extraordinary." "I know," Harry said. "I had 12 of my father's journals to read over Christmas." He raised the detector. The 4 arms of his mother's instrument were all pointing at the back of Quirrell's head, at the face on the back of it, and they were rotating fast now, spinning with the urgency of a compass in the presence of true north. "The stone," Harry said. "You're going to leave it." Whatever you were planning to use it for, the regeneration, the permanent body, you're going to leave it in the castle and you're going to leave this host. And if I choose not to? Then I use what my mother built, Harry said. And it will hurt, and I'd rather it not hurt, because Quirrell is still in there and I'd rather get him out whole if I can. The red eyes looked at him. You're 11 years old, the voice said, and it was bewildered, genuinely bewildered, the bewilderment of a being that has spent 60 years making people afraid of it confronting someone who simply isn't. Almost 12, Harry said, for the third time. You can't destroy me with an instrument, the voice said. Not permanently. I don't die cleanly, boy. I fragment. I survive. I wait. I know, Harry said. I read my mother's research. I know about the Horcruxes. He let that land. Watched the red eyes go very still. I know there are more of them. I know where at least some of them are. I know that even if I drove you out of this host tonight you'd survive in some form until the last one is destroyed. A silence that was different from the others, not calculated, not performing. Actual silence, the silence of something that has just understood the shape of its own situation from the outside for possibly the first time. But, Harry said, I also know that a parasitic attachment to a host body is not sustainable indefinitely. And I know that the stone won't work for you tonight because Dumbledore's protections are still active, the mirror is the last barrier and the mirror won't give it to you because you want it for the wrong reasons and it knows that. He paused. So here's what I'm offering. Leave Quirrell. Leave the stone. Leave the castle. And I will promise you this, I will deal with the Horcruxes. Not immediately, I'm 11 and there are things to manage, but I will deal with them, and when the last one is gone, when there is nothing left anchoring you to a half-life, you will finally be able to die properly. Like every person who has ever lived. He paused. I'm offering you an ending. The voice said nothing for a very long time. You would do that, it said finally. Clear the path to your own destruction. You're going to come back regardless, Harry said. Probably stronger, probably more carefully planned. And when you do, we'll fight, and one of us will end. My mother's magic says it's you. I believe her. He held the detector steady. But if the Horcruxes are gone first, if the anchors are gone, the ending is cleaner. For everyone. The red eyes regarded him. Harry looked back. The cold in the room was absolute. The mirror behind Quirrell reflected them both, an 11-year-old boy with his dead mother's eyes and his dead father's face and 19 ancient lordships ringing in the air around him like a held note, and behind him a darkness that had been trying to be a person for 60 years and had made a catastrophic job of it. Quirrell, the voice said, and it was not speaking to Harry now. It was speaking inward. I'm going to give you back your body. Don't waste it. Quirrell collapsed. Not fell, collapsed, the way a structure does when the thing holding it up withdraws, folding at the knees and going sideways. Harry was across the room before the thought completed itself, caught him under the arms, lowered him to the floor. Quirrell's face was pale and sweating and entirely, only, his own, the back of his head was bare, the turban coming loose, and there was nothing there. Just skin. Just a person. Professor, Harry said. Quirrell's eyes opened. They were ordinary brown. They blinked. What, you're all right, Harry said. You're in the castle. You're going to be all right. McGonagall was in the room. Harry hadn't heard her come in but she was there, kneeling on Quirrell's other side, already performing a diagnostic charm with the speed of someone who has been waiting poised to act. Her expression was controlled and professional and underneath it was the specific anguish of someone who has just seen something they knew was possible but hoped wasn't true. Hermione was in the doorway. She looked at Harry. He looked back. She let out a breath that she'd been holding for possibly the last 20 minutes. She started. He'll need Pomfrey, McGonagall said. Immediately. She looked at Harry. And then she'll need to see you. I'm fine, Harry said. Harry. I'm fine, he said again, and this time she let it go because she could see that it was true. He stood up. He looked at the mirror of Eriste, which was still showing him the image, his parents, the red hair and the glasses, and this time he let himself look for longer, 3 full seconds, before he stepped away. We'll need to move the stone, he said to McGonagall, who was already composing a Patronus message to Dumbledore, and then caught herself, and looked uncertain, and Harry said, send it to Bones. She'll know who to contact. McGonagall sent it to Bones. He went back to the corridor, and Hermione fell into step beside him, and they walked back through the castle together in the direction of the infirmary and then the common room and then the ordinary ongoing business of being first years at Hogwarts, which now included knowing the shape of what was coming and having decided what to do about it. The Horcruxes, Hermione said. Her voice was steady. She was processing. Your mother's research, she identified them. She identified the theory and the mechanism, Harry said. My father's journals might have more specific information. I haven't read all of them yet. I want to read them, she said. Not the private parts. The parts about the research. I know, he said. You can. They walked. The castle was quiet around them, the torches low and warm, the portraits drowsy in their frames. Somewhere below them the grounds were deep in snow. Somewhere in Britain, in a cell in Azkaban, Sirius Black was sleeping or not sleeping through his 12,000-and-something night of wrongful imprisonment, and the review tribunal was scheduled for the 17th of January, and Bones had the evidence, and Harry had made a promise in the vault key to himself that was not in writing and didn't need to be. First things first. But not long now. Harry, Hermione said. They were almost at the infirmary. Yes. What you said to him. In there. She paused. Offering him an ending. That was not what I would have expected. No. It was compassionate, she said. Which is a strange word for a conversation with Voldemort. Harry thought about it. He thought about Dumbledore and the trial, about Lucius Malfoy and the 3 broomsticks, about Snape in the corridor saying better served by a world in which the truth is on record. He thought about his father's letter, I was not the best version of myself in the years before you. I would have been better. People become what they're permitted to become, he said. Or they don't, and there are consequences. Either way you have to look clearly at what's actually in front of you, not what it's easier to see. He pushed open the infirmary door. He was a person once. Whatever he chose to do with that, he was a person once. She looked at him. The expression on her face was the one he'd come to know best, the one that lived under the scholarly precision and the occasional competitive streak, the real Hermione, the one who read everything and felt everything and had decided early that thinking carefully was the best available protection against a world that didn't always reward it. I think, she said, that you're going to be all right. I know I am, he said, and walked inside. January moved on. The 17th arrived, grey and cold, and Harry was in the ministry with McGonagall and Bones for the Black Review Tribunal, and the evidence was presented, and Sirius Black was brought from Azkaban thin and pale and wearing his own sanity the way a man wears something he found on the ground after a long journey, not quite fitting, slightly uncertain of its continuance. He came into the chamber and looked around it, and then he looked at Harry. Harry looked back. Sirius's eyes, grey, like the portraits of his family, but alive in a way the portraits weren't, alive with something that had refused to go out over 12 years of being deliberately extinguished, went from Harry's face to his hands. To the rings. To the Potter ring specifically. His jaw worked. He didn't say anything. He just looked, for a long moment, at the small physical proof that the world had moved in the way he'd needed it to move, and his expression was not relief exactly, more the look of a man who has been holding something against a wind for a very long time and feels the wind finally stop. The tribunal took 4 hours. The evidence was clear. The verdict was unanimous. When they walked out of the ministry and into the street in the cold January afternoon, Sirius stopped on the pavement and put his face up to the sky. just stood there and breathed. The sky was white with cloud and not particularly beautiful, but it was the sky, and he was under it, and there was no stone ceiling and no cold and no dementors and no chain, and Harry stood beside him and didn't say anything because nothing needed to be said. After a minute Sirius looked down. "James's boy," he said. "Yeah," Harry said. "He'd have been unbearable about those rings," Sirius said. "Absolutely insufferable. Carried on for a week when he found out about the Potter lordship alone." A pause, something moving in his face. "He'd have been so proud." "I know," Harry said. "He told me." Sirius looked at him. Harry reached into his breast pocket and took out the letter, folded where it had been folded since Christmas morning, and held it out. Sirius took it. Opened it. Stood on the London pavement in January and read what his best friend had written in October 1981, and whatever he felt was entirely private, and Harry gave him full privacy for it, looking at the street and the white sky and the ordinary world going on around them. After a while Sirius folded the letter and handed it back. "Well," he said. His voice was rough. "Yeah," Harry said. "I have 12 years of interest to make up for," Sirius said. "As a godfather. I'm going to need all the time available," Harry said. "We've got it." Sirius looked at him for a moment. Then he smiled, a real smile, the smile of a man who had kept it somewhere safe through everything and was taking it out to see if it still worked. It did. It looked, Harry thought, like something his father might have invented. "Right then," Sirius said. "All the time available." He looked at McGonagall, who was standing a tactful distance away. "Minerva. You look exactly the same." "You look terrible, Sirius," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "I'll work on that." 3 weeks into the new term, Harry stood at the window of the Gryffindor common room in the early morning before anyone else was up, watching the grounds below and the lake beyond it, silver and cold in the first light. The holding chain was in his hand. All 19 rings catching the grey morning, each one a house and a name and a history stretching backward further than he could see and forward as far as he chose to take it. He thought about everything that had happened since September. He thought about the hat screaming, and the vault, and the Wisengamot, and the mirror of Eriste and the red eyes and the question, what replaced fear? Purpose, he'd said. That was true. But it wasn't only that. He thought about Ron on the garden wall. About Hermione and the annotated book. About Neville's jaw tightening when he talked about his parents. About Augusta's hand on his arm. About Sirius reading a letter on a pavement in January. About McGonagall saying your mother used to say that. He thought about the letter in his breast pocket. I loved you from the moment you existed. I'll love you in whatever comes after this. Purpose was part of it. The rings, the lordships, the trials and committees and the work still to come, all of that was real and all of it mattered. But underneath all of it was something simpler and more load-bearing, something that had been built brick by brick since September, not through strategy or political maneuver but through the accumulation of ordinary moments where people had chosen to be present for each other. He had 19 houses at his back. But more than that, he had 4 or 5 people who would walk through a door with him into whatever was on the other side, not because he was lord of anything, but because they'd decided he was worth walking beside. That was the thing, Harry thought, that Voldemort had never understood. That Dumbledore, in his way, had misunderstood too, the managed boy, the kept small boy, the boy designed to be useful rather than whole. What they had both missed was this: power that exists in isolation is just force. It's the difference between a wall and a home. A wall holds. A home keeps. He was 11 years old. Nearly 12. He held 19 lordships and a dead man's letter and a Horcrux detector built by his mother's own hands, and somewhere in the castle the Philosopher's Stone was being relocated to a more secure facility under Bones's direct supervision, and somewhere in a ministry-safe house a man with grey eyes was sleeping under his own sky for the first time in 12 years. The work ahead was real and he didn't minimize it. The Horcruxes, the return, the fight that was coming eventually regardless of how carefully it was managed. He would do all of it. He would do it with both eyes open and no useful fear and the full weight of everything he was, which turned out to be considerable. But not this morning. This morning was early and grey and quiet, and Harry put the holding chain back in his pocket and picked up the first of his father's journals from the windowsill. He'd been reading them in order, one per week, slow and careful, and settled into the window seat and opened to where he'd left his bookmark, which was the letter, folded small. He read until the sun came up and the castle woke around him and he could hear, distantly, the sound of Ron's feet on the dormitory stairs and Neville saying something to Trevor and the specific noise of a school morning beginning, which was the noise of ordinary life, which was, it turned out, the thing he'd been waiting for all along. He closed the journal. Put the letter back in his pocket. Went to breakfast.